Everyone to today's City Council meeting, our work session of today. What is today? February 16th, 2021. We are grateful to have you joining us as we continue to hold electronic meetings due to the practice of social distancing. Even though we are not in person, this is still considered an open and public meeting. For the work session, we welcome members of the public who may be watching our usual video feeds on the Council's agenda page, YouTube, SLC TV, or Facebook Live. As many of you know, there is no public comment during a work session. However, please feel free to join us for the 7 p.m. formal meeting tonight to share any comments you have during the general comment period. Your, of course, is always welcome, and you can reach the City Council anytime by mailing us at P.O. Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114, or emailing us at council.comments@slcgov.com, or by calling our 24-hour phone comment line at 801-535-7654. With that, we will now move on to our work session items. Our first item on the agenda is our updates from the administration. So I see Mayor Mendenhall here. Thank you, Mayor, for joining us. It's always nice to see you at our meetings. I also see Lisa Schaefer, our Chief Administrative Officer, and and there's Rachel. We've got the whole crew, and Rachel Otto, the Chief of Staff. So I don't know what your order is, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to the mayor and go from there.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think you just get me today, unless there's questions or details that Lisa and Rachel have, if council members have any questions. And it's not too long an update today. I wanted to give you a brief update on our employees and COVID. 36% of our total city family have used city provided or federally provided leave at this point. Our city HR webpage will start showing updates on vaccines, including where and when they are being given as they become available. And we wanted to just thank the council where federal support hasn't always been sufficient. We're grateful for the support to use our own city dollars to ensure that our employees always have access to paid leave for exposure, illness, or taking care of family members related to COVID. I want to give you an update on Raise Up SLC. You remember that the Salt Laker card was launched late last year, in the summer actually, and cash benefits are designed to go out through the form of a debit card at $500 per person to people who did not qualify or could not access federal stimulus funds. So our partners in getting those debit cards out to the community members are the Community Foundation of Utah, University Neighborhood Partners, Comunidades Unidas, and Utah Community Action Program. Those partners have distributed a total of $199,000 worth of support to our residents. And it's spectacular, but we have more money to distribute. So right now we need to get the word out even more to make sure that these funds get into people's hands in Salt Lake City proper by June 31st, because there are CARES dollars here. and our own city budget process, we need to get these funds distributed in the next few months. I'm going to put two links in the chat in just a second, and those are the websites where people can go to apply and fill out an online form, or they can go directly to these community support partners. I'll reiterate that it's Comunidades Unidas, University Neighborhood Partners, and the Community Foundation of Utah, Utah Community Action, or CAP. So I'll put those links, or somebody will help me put those links in the chat in just a moment. They're in English and Spanish and help people connect with those resources. We know the residents are out there. We've just got to connect with them and get them these $500 cards. I want to give a brief update on homelessness, as we do every week. Our teams worked with the county health department last week to do just an environmental cleanup on 7th South and the Rio Grande area, because there were not open beds that day for some of the residents of the Rio Grande area at the time that the health department came in. They were allowed to reestablish the camp after it was cleaned up from a public health and safety standpoint. Our service provider outreach teams will be doing intensive work there over the next week or more to connect as many people as possible with services and shelter. And just a reminder, we have the dashboard active, and it's always updated with the last night's information, which is the soonest information we can get from those service providers to share. And even at the time, the fluidity of bed availability is very volatile. So at the moment in time when that cleanup happened, there weren't beds available. It doesn't mean there weren't beds available within 24 hours after that. That's why this continued outreach is going to do everything we can to get people into shelter from that area. There's also some new and some growing camps in the areas of 8th and 9th South and 3rd to 4th West, as well as in a few locations along North Temple. So the city and the county are working together to form outreach and resolution plans for these sites, as we continuously do. I wanted to give you an update on housing. Of course, you can interrupt me if you have any questions at any point, please do. But thanks again to the council for your support and direction on the HUD funds over the past several months. You're going to be considering adopting a resolution in the formal meeting tonight that allocates over $4.5 million toward housing stability, shelter, and homeless services. These funds will make an enormous difference in the lives of Salt Lake City residents who are experiencing or are at risk of experiencing homelessness. I want to put this amount of money in context of our city's investments in affordable housing and housing stabilization, not including the millions, about 15 million that we invest into homeless services each year. So through 2016 to 2020, we as a city invested in just over $64 million in affordable housing. And that resulted in 2,539 units of housing. This includes new or rehabbed projects that received funding from the RDA, Housing Trust Fund, HDTF, and HDF, the home fee. Fee waivers also were part of it, land discounts or land write-downs. So that's a tremendous amount of investment. Housing stability assistance that was available in 2020 was $3.2 million in rental assistance and $250,000 in mortgage assistance. And as you know, the rental assistance versus mortgage assistance was informed by the most up-to-date data we could get from the Kempsey Gardner Policy Center and Jim Wood's research that informed how much we should break that out. And that housing stability assistance includes programs that are funded by HUD, ESG, Home, and HOPWA, and are funding our future and our general fund from the city. So it's part federal and part of our own tax dollars. In 2021, in addition to the $4.5 million that you're going to hopefully be approving tonight, we'll be dispersing some new funding for housing stability assistance through the U.S. Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program. That's the $6+ million that we have talked about in the last couple of weeks that will assist households that are unable to pay their rent and their utilities. So it's a dynamic fund, not just for your rental, but also for your back payments on utilities. due to COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a tremendous amount of money. We're grateful for the council working with us to get it through our own internal processes in a transparent and a appropriate way for the federal dollars, and looking forward hopefully to you approving that 4.5 million tonight. That's all for my update, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have some.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Council members, any questions? Okay, seeing no hands, I will turn it over to whoever's next. Lisa, Rachel, Chief. I see the chief here. That might come later, but Rachel or Lisa?
Actually, thanks, Council Chair. I think Chief Brown is now on deck to give a quick update on policing.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Council. It's a pleasure to be here today on this snowy Tuesday. What I'd like to talk about today is, I know every week for the last little while, the Racial Equity Police Commission has given updates to the council and to everybody as far as the work that they're doing and some of their recommendations. I want to point out something. Last week, I think Dante spoke to the Field Training Officer program that we have. Field training officers, those are the ones that take the brand new recruits when they come out of the academy, and they put them through a 16-week evaluation process. The rep, as we call them, the Racial Equity Police Commission, looked at the diversity of our FTO program, and I think they came back and said out of the approximately 60 officers that we have, only 6 were from diverse backgrounds, which was not as diverse as we'd like to be. This morning, I had the opportunity to welcome a new class of field training officers. We welcomed 20 new officers that we have recruited out of the department to be a part of this program. And I'm happy to report back that of those 20, 7 are of diverse background. So with one fell swoop, we doubled our diversity, which is good. But we're going to do better, and we've got plans to build a process and a program to really recruit that type of diversity into our police department, because diversity really is like throwing a rock in a pond. You throw the rock in and the ripples go out. It goes out through our department, and then as we go out through the community, it ripples through the community. The communities look at us, and then they want to come back. They want to be part of this organization. So as we've talked about our hiring and recruitment practices, the last class that we hired, 10 of which were of diverse backgrounds. And so that's 30%, that's 30% of those officers that we hired. So the diversity that we bring into this department builds that trust and relationships into our community. And then the community returns and brings that diversity back to us. So it's really diversity begets diversity. But I just wanted to give that update. A lot of exciting things are happening. And so we'll talk a little bit more, I think, in a couple of weeks about recruitment and hiring. But thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer those.
Thank you, Chief. Darren?
Yeah, thank you so much for that update. Just for my clarification, so you said there was, I couldn't follow along with all the numbers, 6 of 60, and then 7 of 20, and then something. Can you just recap those numbers, like where we are and what the new class meant?
Okay.
Sorry, I just couldn't follow along. Thanks.
No, I understand. There's a cadre of field training officers. We call them FTOs because we like acronyms. But anyway, we have about 60 in the department. Well, as we prepare to take on the new recruits that are coming out of the academy and the ones we'll be getting here shortly, we would like to build up that pool of FTOs. And so we went through and selected 20 new recruits, and they started a 2-day or a 20-hour training program. And so of those 20 new police officers that all raised their hand and said, I want to do this job, 7 are of diverse background. So we had 60, and 6 of them were of diverse background. The 20 that we brought on today, 7 of those are diverse background. So we've more than doubled the diversity of our FTO program in one day. But that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's that one specific program within the department.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, I'm excited to further this conversation. I really appreciate this update. Thanks, Chief Brown.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Anyone else? And Rachel, was there more updates from administration?
Nope, unless you have anything else you want us to try to address. That's it.
World peace?
Working on it.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we will move to item number 2 on our agenda. Also, thank you, Rachel, Lisa, Mayor, and Chief Brown for joining us today. Item number 2 is updates on racial equity and policing, and I will turn the time over to Allison Rowland from the City Council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick update on my behalf, or from me, let's just say from me. Speaking of the REP Commission, there are subcommittee meetings tomorrow, February 17th. They include School Safety Subcommittee at 4 p.m., Policies and Practice at 4 p.m., and Officer Training at 5 p.m. So council members and the public can listen in. There are comment periods. Probably the easiest way to say it is Google SLC REP Commission, and you'll be able to get the agendas for those and the links to the actual meetings. The next full commission meeting will be on February 24th, next week at 5 p.m. I believe Ben Ledke from our staff also has some things he'd like to add.
Thanks, Allison. On February 10th, the Matrix Auditors gave a presentation to the Racial Equity and Policing Commission. It is an overview of the council's audit of the police department, and there were several back and forth questions and answers with commission members. The presentation, as well as a video of the briefing, are available on the audit page of the council website. The REP Commission's 3 sets of draft recommendations were also shared with Matrix. These are the same recommendations the council received last month. The finance department has set up direct access for the auditors to run their own reports in the city's financial system. This process is already used for the city's annual financial audit, and it will save time for the consultants and for city staff. Today, we received a draft of the police department financial profile created by the auditors. This was sent to the council about an hour ago. It will be made publicly available once it's complete. It's being reviewed internally right now. The financial profile has details about the financial structure of the revenues, expenses, and how those are classified in the department. So for example, each program and function within a division will show the authorized staff positions, the revenues, the expenditures, and the variance from budget to actual over the last 3 fiscal years. This is a greater level of detail than is typically reviewed by the council in the annual budget. And the financial profile also identifies 194 unique cost codes. And these are going to be key information for the auditors when they review the expenses to make sure that they're categorized and accounted for correctly. This profile is a foundation to develop a zero-based budgeting process. Analysis of the budget and findings and recommendations will be next. The other deliverable that's nearly complete is the organization profile of the police department, and that's anticipated to have a draft ready for review later this week. Once the financial profile and the organization profile are complete, the auditors will proceed to looking at internal affairs, the discipline system, and categorizing those line item costs based on the 194 cost codes. That's everything I have, Madam Chair.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you for that. Are there any questions from council members? Sorry, I don't see anything. Sorry about that. I just received a text that Kate, who is scheduled next, Kate Bradshaw, our city government relations lobbyist, who's scheduled next on agenda item number 3, is on the Senate floor right now. So we'll let her do her job and skip agenda item number 3 until Kate's able to join us. And that will take us to agenda item number 4, which is the rezone at approximately 706 to 740 West, 900 South, and 710 to 739 West Genesee Avenue. And for this briefing, we have Brian Fulmer from the Council Office Policy Analyst Department, Amy Thompson, Senior Planner, Chris Earl, Blake Thomas, Nick Norris, and Molly Robinson, all from CAN and Planning. So I will turn it over to Brian. Thanks, Brian. Hi, by the way.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Madam Chair. As you mentioned, this is a request to rezone the properties, which also include 2 unnamed alley segments. And council members will recall you voted to vacate one of the alley segments in August of 2020, and you were briefed on the other alley segment that the applicant is requesting to be vacated on January 19th of this year. A public hearing on that second alley segment vacation is scheduled for March 2nd and a potential vote on March 16th. So there's a little background there. The subject parcels are currently zoned M1, which is light manufacturing, and the request is to change the zoning designation to RMU, or residential mixed use, to construct multifamily housing. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy Thompson and Chris Earl.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry, let me grab my notes. I was thinking 3:10, so get prepared here. So as Brian mentioned, this is a request by the property owner for a map amendment to rezone 12 parcels and 2 portions of alley at approximately 706 to 740 West 9th South and 710 to 739 West Genesee Avenue. The properties are currently zoned light manufacturing, and the request is to rezone those to RMU. And the petitions both received a favorable recommendation from the Planning Commission. And can you guys see my screen, or is somebody else doing the presentation? And I need to say next slide.
We cannot see your screen. I'm not sure if somebody there. Amanda's on it. Thanks, Amanda.
Great.
Welcome.
Okay. So next slide, please. So this is just a map of the zoning of the properties as well as the surrounding zoning for reference. Next slide. And this is just a picture of the site from the corner of 900 South and 7th West. There are 2 existing commercial buildings on the site, and the applicant plans to rehabilitate those for restaurant and retail type uses and that are allowed under the existing M1. And then their intent is to redevelop the rest of that site with multifamily housing, which currently isn't allowed under M1. So that's the purpose of this rezone request. Next slide, please. And the subject properties are located west of Interstate 15 along 900 South, which is one of the gateways to the west side neighborhoods. Several community uses surround the subject site, including the 9-line trail, the 9-line bike park, community gardens. The street frontage of the vacant portion of the properties is along 900 South, 700 West, and Genesee Avenue. The surrounding properties on the block are zoned M1. However, with the exception of just a few properties, the primary use is predominantly single-family residential. There's also a religious use directly adjacent to the site on the northeast corner. It's occupied by the Summum religious group. Next slide, please. The project's situated along 900 South and 700 West Industrial Corridor, an area the West Side Master Plan identifies as an important gateway into the larger West Side community. The parcels included in the proposed rezone are currently underutilized, mostly vacant land that's identified in the master plan as an appropriate area for high-density housing. Next slide, please. This is just a simple comparison of the existing and the proposed zoning regulations. So under the existing M1 zone, under the proposed RMU zoning districts, the interior side yard setback is the same as what's allowed under the existing M1 zone. And under the proposed RMU zone, the rear yard setback is greater than what's required under the existing M1 zone. I just want to note that depending on how the applicants end up configuring the site for the development, it's possible that the site may not have any rear yard. The yard areas would be determined when a building is actually proposed for the site. So I just want to point that out. Next slide, please. Planning staff recommended to the Planning Commission, and Planning Commission adopted this recommendation that they forwarded to City Council to impose the design guidelines that are applicable to the D2 zoning district. The proposed RMU zoning district has minimal design standards that would apply to any development under this zoning designation. The design standards are the 40% ground floor glass requirement for facades facing the street, and 15-foot maximum length of any blank wall, uninterrupted by windows, doors, or architectural detailing at the ground floor along the street-facing facade. Under the RMU design standards, something like structured parking could be located on the ground floor, which would not be consistent with the active pedestrian-oriented design envisioned in the master plan for this important gateway. So staff, this also came, this condition of approval also came out of the community feedback that the city as well as the applicant did on their own with the public. The Poplar Grove Community Council and the Glendale Community Council both submitted letters of support for this project. There has been some current concerns expressed by the Summum group. Again, that's the property just north of the, it's, I guess, northeast on the corner of this block. They have expressed concerns, and we held a meeting with them on Friday. Their main concerns, I believe, relate to setbacks, height, and light, blocking light that could happen with this proposed building. And with that, I can take any questions, or I'm not sure if the applicants are on. Hopefully they are.
So this is Justin with AJC Architects, and I believe Max Korth is going to want to speak. I believe I see him logged on now.
Thank you, Justin. We generally give applicants about 5 minutes to address the council. So I'm happy to turn the time over to whoever wants to address the council from you guys.
Max, do you have the ability to talk yet, or do you want me to begin speaking?
Hey guys, I'm sorry I'm late. Is it my turn to speak, Justin?
Yes, thanks.
Sorry, I had some technical difficulty. And I'm going to stop my video. Anyway, I don't want to keep you guys long. I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks Amy for a presentation. This is a pretty exciting day because I think we've been working on this for a very long time, up to 3 years, and I'm very thankful to the community, the neighbors, planning staff, RDA, everybody that's been involved in sort of trying to get this project done. I think Amy said it pretty well. I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of history so they kind of understand what's actually going on behind it. This site came to my attention about 3 years ago. And what was pretty unique about it is initially the two sites were actually, those two buildings that you see on the west side were actually not under the same ownership. They had been a long time ago, but they had since then been under different ownership. So we had the opportunity to sort of put the site back together. And that was obviously very appealing. And one of the things we did when we had that opportunity is to canvass, obviously, the community. We talked with neighbors, community council about, potential development, what the community wanted to see there. And it was pretty clear very early on that, what people really wanted was businesses, restaurants. They wanted to see more businesses on that side of the railroad tracks or the freeway. So we kind of came up with this plan to sort of reinvigorate, reactivate those two buildings. They're obviously beautiful buildings. We want to keep them going. We love the history behind them. So we actually we're very thankful the RDA worked with us to try to come up with a plan to finance and sort of make those buildings active again. That's actually work that's currently in progress. So the idea there is to eventually have businesses, coffee shops, restaurants, potentially other businesses housed out of those two buildings on the west side, and to really create to sort of patronize those businesses. One of the things I think we found out is the density in this neighborhood is not that high. There's a lot of single family homes. To really support the businesses, we needed to maybe create a little bit more density in housing, also diversify the housing type. Obviously, the master plan, as Amy said, is in favor of sort of creating more multifamily in these nodes, where we obviously have a site that's empty currently, where we can actually build some multifamily that's a little bit denser. So the plan really is to create these businesses for the community, but also obviously bring in the housing to support those businesses. So obviously in all our discussions with everybody, that was really the plan. Obviously to activate, to bring more people there, to actually create more of a community, a sense of community, to bring together all those facets. And obviously that's why we're here before you, to sort of ask for that rezone, in the sense of we want to create this activity, this node. I think it also dovetails a little bit with a lot of the plans the city has for the 9 line to create connectivity between east and west, given the proximity to the freeway. Obviously, this used to be M1 zoned. I think because of the proximity to the freeway, we think given the fact that we are close to the freeway, would be a great gateway to the west side. Obviously, like we said, there's a lot of efforts and money being spent on the 9 line to extend it all the way there. So I think, again, our project really would dovetail nicely with, I think, the efforts the city has put into creating this connectivity to the Jordan River Trail Park. So having said all that, we really, I don't want to go over my time, but we really feel it's quite appropriate to change the zoning, but we really want to see more diversified housing type here. The city is short on housing, so we feel this is a great opportunity to create that.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Council members, do you have any questions for the applicants or Amy? Dan?
Thank you for the quick overview. A couple on the development side of the house. Curiosity, is it all leasing, or are there any of them for home ownership? And what's kind of your thoughts on the affordable housing side?
I think currently the plans are to create a diverse mix of units. We want to create some live work. We want to create some townhomes, some small units. We're talking about micro units as well as normal studios. I think currently, given the plans, we're really thinking about leasing, so not ownership. So that's essentially what the plan is currently.
And multiple layers of different affordable housing?
We want, I mean, again, a lot of that has to do with financing, and obviously, but one of the things we want to create is, whether you want to call it affordable or attainable, we want to create, studios and price points that are within the realm of, for younger people. Again, I have a few projects in the city. To me, the city is lacking in, housing for young families and housing for young people, right? So I think that's kind of the two areas that I'm focused on in creating, obviously, small studios that are, affordable, attainable, that are smaller size. I mean, we're talking between 375 square feet and 500 square feet, and obviously then as well townhomes for young families.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've been talking to Max and the crew for a couple of years now, I guess. There's a lot of support for the redevelopment of the two existing structures on the west side and for general redevelopment here as well from the neighborhood. The Sumum religious community, their representatives met on Friday with Max, the architect, city planning, myself, and their concerns are really around the impact of the proposed buildings that haven't been proposed yet, but would be put here for residential, would have on light and sort of noise and parking on their corner of that lot. So for planning, first question is, you said that depending on how the buildings are oriented or buildings oriented, it may not have a rear or side setback requirement. Talk through that a little bit for us, if you wouldn't mind.
So the yard areas are determined just by our definition of yard, and because there isn't a specific development associated with this project, I think it may be possible that it doesn't have a rear yard. It has frontage on 3 streets, and I think some of those interior yards may be interior side yards, which there isn't an interior side yard setback associated with the RMU. There's none required, and there's none required with the existing zone as well, the M1. I'm not certain if the yard areas would be determined once we actually have a building on the site to look at. I just wanted to note that because I know that that was one of the points that we were discussing on Friday.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of support for yeah, thank you, Amy. There's a lot of support for the development, but I think that is the one issue because there's only 2 frontages there on that property to the northeast. And they've done a lot of horticultural work, some animals, you know, relying on the sunlight, I guess, a lot. And figuring out how do we balance a new development here, which is needed, with some of their existing needs as well, which we may not be able to address until after, but the RMU really doesn't set any buffers there at all, as she said, depending on how it's oriented. So that'd be a concern. Maybe for Max or Justin, why the RMU versus, say, an FPU or something?
Sorry, Andrew, I couldn't hear the last piece. What you said, why the RMU versus what?
Another zoning, like a form-based kind of zone.
I mean, to be frank with you, I think one of our interests was, you know, given the fact that we're giving up a lot of land to protect, you know, those 2 adaptive, you know, those 2 buildings, we wanted to go a little bit higher, just to create sort of, you know, one of our hopes is to create an ecosystem so that we have enough critical mass to support those businesses. So really, it's really about the RMU zone versus, say, something else. I mean, that's really kind of, and it's residential, obviously. You know, it has a lot of the components that, you know, it fits the residential neighborhood, but it allows us to go a little bit taller. Justin, do you want to add anything?
So my understanding is that the RMU zone has been favored by planning in relation to, you know, like residential multifamily zones that are currently available to ask for. So that's one reason why we would be asking for the RMU, is because it's looked on, as we understand it, as a more favorable solution for the urban multifamily developments that are, you know, the future of Salt Lake City. It also allows and encourages the street uses with the, you know, retail or opportunity for live work or something along those lines that we think will help create a vibrant streetscape and sidewalkscape that will help really build the neighborhood. Those are all aspects that we're looking to have as qualities of the future building, and that we believe that the RMU gives us flexibility. The other thing that you know, that is being entertained as part of this rezone is that the RMU would get the D2 design standards associated with it, which will even enhance further the requirements of the RMU and give the city more control over the future development and its relationship to the sidewalk and street. So those are all things that make the RMU attractive to us, and which will be a great framework for the future building as we step from a rezone into design. So.
Thanks, Justin and Max.
Yeah.
Amy, is that sort of accurate from a sort of a planning perspective?
I think they proposed the RMU and we looked at that and gave a favorable recommendation for it. In terms of some of the requirements of the RMU, it is lacking in terms of street engagement. It doesn't require active ground floor use. It doesn't require visual interest, which is why we've recommended adding those D2 design standards. So the RMU zone alone actually has minimal design standards, which is why we've recommended those additional D2 standards imposed. But otherwise, yes, that's accurate. We didn't look at form-based zones just because that's not what was proposed, but we could certainly do that if the council wanted us to look further into that. I think the form-based zones would not give, for the most part, I think they wouldn't give them the height that they're looking to get, that the RMU would give them, which is 75 feet.
Okay. It's helpful. I appreciate it, Amy. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any other questions from council members to any of our participants today? Okay, seeing none, it looks like we will have a hearing to accept public comment on March 2nd and then tentative action on March 16th. So we will revisit this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Now, agenda item number 5, the street lighting master plan has been pulled and will be placed on a future agenda. I don't know if that's on everyone's agenda that you see that it's been pulled or just mine. So I just wanted to make it a public record that if you did see it, it has been pulled. So we are cruising right along, and we're not going to have a tentative break because we've only been here for 40 minutes and I know y'all can handle it longer than that. So we're going to go straight to agenda item number 7, which is our ordinance, a briefing regarding zoning text amendments for off-street parking. And we have Russell Weeks from our council staff, Eric Deems, Nick Norris, and Wayne Mills, all from planning. So I will turn the time over to Russell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, this item has been in the works a long time. It is a rewrite of the current regulations for off-street parking. And it divides the city into 4 off-street parking contexts based on land use. The Planning Division will go into that in further detail during its presentation. The primary goals of the revision include better reflecting the market demand and the city's objectives and simplifying how the ordinance reads, among other things. The planners also have suggested 2 amendments that are not in the ordinance that was in the packet. One involves parking spaces for bicycles in areas zoned for commercial and industrial uses. The other involves loading berths for multifamily structures. I'd also like to direct the council's attention to the policy questions in the staff report. And Amanda has the presentation from planning available. So take it away, Eric and Amanda.
All right, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, Eric.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks, Madam Chair, members of the council. Appreciate being with you here today. Even if it's a little early, that almost makes it a little better. So we'll see if we can get through this quickly as well. Like Russell explained, this has been a long time in the coming. This has got roots in 2017, way back then. So we'll go ahead and go through a few items with this. Next slide, please. So in looking at this, just to keep it quite simple and kind of breaking it down, the initial request and the background on this is that we were to examine the off-street parking regulations including the minimum and maximum parking requirements, which we believed had become quite outdated, and the permitted alternatives to those minimum and maximums. In other words, the ways that people could reduce or increase those numbers, and then just our general parking lot design and dimensional standards. So that's what we set out to do just 3.5 years ago here. So next slide, please. Let's see. Okay. So in looking kind of at our purposes here, there were so many things we are attempting to accomplish, and I'll let your eye kind of float to the different purposes that were outlined here. But first and foremost, we wanted to align the parking chapter with the goals of the master plans and the neighborhood plans of the city. We wanted to modernize it to reflect best practices and the dynamics of our changing city. We wanted to create standards that reflected market demand and that reinforced Salt Lake City as a place for people and not just cars. We wanted to do our part to eliminate barriers to affordable housing and economic development. We wanted to do our part to reduce auto dependency and encourage people to encourage alternatives, and then minimize the impacts of parking to the neighborhoods and into the environment and our air quality. And then we wanted to simplify the ordinance to be more user-friendly. Next slide, please. So you'll have noticed this is a large chapter update. The ordinance itself is about 40 pages finished, and the staff report 200 pages. So how do we break that down and look at what it actually means? And so these things right here were the key chapter updates. And so first and foremost, we wanted to realign our purpose statements, and that kind of goes along with those things that I just shared, of what purposes parking can accomplish and what it can do to meet the goals of the city. We wanted to relax requirements for expansion or change of use. We want to be able to reuse the different buildings we already have, the housing stock we have, the potential that's already in our built environment. We wanted to create parking context, and we'll get into that more fully in a little bit here, but we felt that that was key, and just kind of this idea of when it comes to parking, one size does not fit all. And then we wanted to revise our strategies for minimum and maximum parking, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well. We wanted to increase bike parking throughout the city and change our approach on that. And then we wanted to re-examine and update our parking alternatives. We created this transportation demand management a number of years back. We wanted to evaluate if it was working, what aspects were working, which ones were not, and make thorough updates there. So those are the key chapter updates. Next slide, please. Next slide. Right there. Hi, can you hear me?
We can now.
Okay, sorry, I lost everything for a minute there.
That's okay.
Okay. Apologize, lost my place a little bit. Okay, so looking at these parking contexts, we'll just go over these briefly. There's 4 contexts. The first and most intense is our transit context. So of course, you're going to think anywhere that's really well served by mass transit, high density development, and of course, those have the lowest parking demand. So this was downtown, near the Gateway, and then along our major transit corridors of North Temple and 400 South. So that's what these areas were. And the way we figured the different contexts is based on zoning designation, and you'll see what that looks like in just a minute. But just to kind of put that in context a little bit of what a transit context is and how we applied parking to it. Next slide. Okay, so then going down in intensity, our next most intense context is the urban center context. And so think of areas, Sugar House or downtown adjacent, kind of, they're high density, they definitely have a lot of pedestrian activity and potential, but they are still accessed either on a regional scale, or they still have a component where, some parking is in demand, but, still quite dense. Next slide. The next is what I would consider the most challenging and diverse parking context. It's the neighborhood center context. So these are the small neighborhood nodes. Kind of the poster child for this is, of course, like 9th and 9th. And these have plenty of pedestrian scale development and amenities, but they don't have the same level of mass transit or alternatives that are provided in some other locations. Not only that, they do attract clientele or people on a regional scale, so there's people that are commuting into them. And they by far have the most varied parking needs. They need low entries to get into, or low parking minimums for buildings to be reutilized and things like that. But they also need high maximums so they don't, so that the impacts of cars coming into the neighborhood isn't too heavy. So you can see the applicable zoning designations for that context. Next slide. The last one is our general context, and that is basically all other zoning districts. And that's everything from single-family residential neighborhoods to our industrial and manufacturing areas. And then places that are more auto-dependent, think 300 West, things like that, the car is the primary means to access the housing, the businesses, the workplaces. So next slide. So this is what it looks like on the map. Of course, the transit context is really quite a large area. It's probably our largest area besides general, and focuses on, of course, the downtown and then on our rail lines, and shows the strides that we feel we've made with transportation options in the last few years. And then, of course, you have urban center, this green, neighborhood center in blue, a little more sporadic throughout the city, the smaller nodes, and everything else in the general context. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so a few of the things we wanted to look at today that we felt were important was to talk about the alternatives we have to our parking calculations. And I should mention, or just clarify, that within the context, each land use still is given a parking minimum and maximum. So they're still organized in that fashion. But that, for example, a restaurant in the transit context is going to have different parking needs than a restaurant in the neighborhood center or a restaurant in the general context. So those serve as the baseline of our parking requirements, and then these alternatives allow them to raise the increase the maximum or to lower the minimums. And so the first thing we've proposed in the new ordinance is to drop the transit demand management strategies altogether. As we looked at those and really did a study on them, there was a few things. One, there were certain areas of the city where they were being stacked quite heavily, and oftentimes for very minimal concessions, developers were lowering their minimums to a point that it was putting a burden on the surrounding neighborhoods and really not creating a scenario that really lowered the demand for parking. We looked at some of those and they sounded well at the time, and I think just in real practice, some of them just didn't work out like we anticipated. Additionally, that there was a little process to go through to get those TDM strategies. So with the new ordinance, we feel we've done more to kind of right size the parking within the context areas, that they are not as critical as they once were. And then we've examined kind of the ones that we felt were the most important and re-examined them and then included them, a revised version of them in this new proposed ordinance. So first and foremost is that in the revised parking chapter, they would be allowed to have up to a 40% combined reduction from the current minimums. And those come from standards related to affordable and senior housing, carpool, car share, which is new for us, and then proximity. There's new standards on the proximity to mass transit, and that also includes proximity, just for clarification, that's to tracks, lines, and to high frequency bus routes, which the city has invested in heavily over the last little while. And then there's a revised strategies for shared parking. Let's see. We also I'm sorry. Okay, and then we also provided for a parking study and revised strategies for that can be approved on an administrative level. It's got more complex criteria, but would also allow for people to submit a parking study deeming that they, how they would need some other requirement other than the minimums or maximums that we provide. And it's our only strategy to be able to increase parking, but it can also be used to reduce parking minimums. Next slide. So looking at the parking minimums and maximums a little more closely. The current strategy was adopted through a pretty complex system, but there are a lot of going through different uses and things like that, but they were really old and they didn't often correlate to what was actually needed on the ground, and they just hadn't been revised and updated for a long time. And a lot of them kind of have their same originations in old parking manuals and things like that, and then just had slight revisions throughout the years. So the new minimums and maximums that we're recommending were based on our work with a consultant that examined various parking studies, but also new approaches and new counts on varying cities throughout the country, and looking at city and neighborhood goals. And then we worked really closely with a lot of partners throughout this. We worked with a number of developers, including a lot of housing developers, and then closely with like the Downtown Alliance and other advisory groups to see what kind of parking was actually needed. And they really were a valuable asset in the process to really comb through those recommendations of the minimums and maximums. Overall, the minimums throughout the city we're proposing are generally lower than the current standards. And the maximums are now, what we used to do is most of the maximums, sometimes they were either identical to the minimums, or they were based on a percentage of the minimum. So you could go 25% higher or something like that. They're now based on these same consultant recommendations, neighborhood goals, all that kind of stuff. So, more on best practice than just a random percentage. It should also be noted that structured parking is not counted against our maximums, and I wanted to point that out because we feel we've got standards in place that would allow for more flexibility with structured parking, being able to accommodate multiple properties, or being able to kind of be a little bit more of a block by block or regional parking solutions, things like that. And we have standards in place for the structures to be designed well, convertible later, so they could be repurposed in the future for other type of uses. And of course, they're located behind main structures. So I wanted to point that out. I mentioned that minimums are generally lower throughout the proposed updates. One exception to that, for example, is when we look at the neighborhood center, this was a really hot topic. We look at the neighborhood center context, so think like 9th and 9th area. We lowered the minimum, but we also raised the maximum. So it used to be 2.5 stalls per 1,000 square feet that were allowed. And now we found that that was woefully underparked. And what it was doing was making it so businesses essentially had to have parking spill out all over into the neighborhoods. So by raising that and raising actually parking for restaurants in a number of the contexts, we found that that was one area we were underparked. And hopefully this is able to, we're able to find some spaces where those could increase. Cars could park in a parking lot rather than spilling entirely into our neighborhoods. So those are just a few of the items I wanted to point out with those. Next slide. Another one of our kind of big ticket items in this was the multifamily parking. Seemed to be this is one of the topics that pretty much everyone had feedback on. And so I wanted to just list in the table here what we are proposing. So of course that's the context across the top, and then these are the minimums listed below, and then the maximums on the far right. It's pretty hard to get exact comparisons to our current ordinance, because our current ordinance, there are so many different types of criteria across the zoning designations that it becomes really complex to try to look at and make an apples to apples comparison. But I think key points are that in the D1, the D3, D4, GMU, UI, RMU, the Sugar House zoning districts, the RB and the S&B, we're proposing lower minimums across the board. So that would hopefully be an aid towards objectives like more affordable housing and things like that. And then in the D2 and TSA-T zones, we're proposing a lower parking minimum for studio apartments, but a little bit higher on the 1 bedroom and above. And a little bit higher minimums for the FBUN1 zone, and one of the discussions we want to have, if I can bring your attention to those maximums on the far right. These are based on the recommendations from the consultant. And we have some concerns that maybe those are a little high. And I think that that's a conversation we need to have is see if that's actually appropriate for each context. Again, especially where we have some opportunities like structured parking doesn't have the same maximums. Maybe these maximums are high that someone could come in and do that as surface parking. Now, part of it is also that, and we heard this from many people, is that parking is very expensive, land is expensive, and that generally they don't want to devote too much space to it. They're going to be their lenders, their partners, financial partners are very aware of what's happening with the parking, and they find those numbers, and they do not want to go above what they actually need. So that's something we'll want to have a conversation on. Next slide. Also, there's a few recent items that are new since this went to Planning Commission. First is we've had the text amendment from Ilium Masonry Facility to the congregate care. That's largely just talking about, largely it's a text change, but it does have a few recommendations for parking that should be taken into consideration. And then we do have pending changes to our special exception chapters. And there are a few items that are addressed there. Those pending changes to the special exception process and language are written with the anticipation of the adoption of this proposed ordinance. And they speak to front yard parking regulations and vehicle storage without hard surfacing. So we would anticipate probably that this would go through and be passed, and then the special exception changes when they come through your office would further modify the front yard parking and vehicle storage for without hard surfacing. The next item that's recent is our Transportation Division's been working with Fair and Piers with a parking study that affects the Central 9th and 9th and 9th areas. It looks like we got a recommendation just this morning from them, but they, to be very brief on that, their analysis is that in the Central 9th area, which would be part of the transit context, that the parking minimums are too low, that there's not currently a diverse enough mix of land uses, that even though the area is well serviced by transit, automobiles are still needed more than what are being provided. And then the last item would be, just with so much emphasis on affordable housing, we just need to probably evaluate whether the proposed affordable housing reductions are adequate. I know I've kind of whipped through things, but those are really the main topics from our end, and be happy to address any questions or get into any topics further. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Eric. I will turn the time over to council members to ask questions. I see Darren has a hand up, and then Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I have a few questions. Generally, I like the direction that this off-street parking ordinance is going. I think it is a better fit for where our city is right now and where we're wanting to go in the future. So I think overall, I know it's been a huge effort. I remember many times hearing this when I was on the Planning Commission over a year ago, and I know it wasn't new then, so I know you've been working on it for a really long time. And I want to respect that and not try and sort of upend anything. I do have a few questions though. One, sort of the broadest question I think is that this is based on the zone type or the actual zone, not necessarily the area or context to transit. I know that that's sort of in the different contexts, that's understood that like more transit oriented areas have lower parking than some others. But for instance, I'm just thinking of in District 5, almost the entire ballpark area is, I believe, in the general context, which requires the highest transportation or the highest parking requirements because it's kind of general commercial or commercial corridor, which is also applied to places like, I think, Redwood Road. However, I think parking requirement wise, ballpark has so much more in terms of the track station running right through it and high frequency buses than other parts of the city with that same zone. So I'm worried that there are some places where lower parkings actually make more sense, but this is requiring it to be higher parking. Maybe since that's kind of a big question, can we address that before I keep going?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump
Sure.
in. This is Nick. Part of the thought process on that is that those areas would be going through zoning changes. And so instead of trying to make it fit now through a different approach, we felt it was probably easier to do it by the district, and then as those areas change, as the zoning changes, particularly around the ballpark, which hopefully we start this year, but that would be our avenue to address the parking issues. The code does give them a reduction, any uses within, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I think a quarter mile of that transit station, a reduction off the top. So that does help to some degree with right sizing those zoning requirements.
So that would go to that a maximum of 40% reduction that could be allowed under the different sort of options that developers have to go with. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the reasons why one of the questions that I think that we want to get some direction from the council on is the extent of how we, lack of a better term, pile on those reductions. One of the things that we've had issues with in the past is that in places where the reductions were so extensive and available regardless of where they were occurring, that we would have some places where there were no other alternatives for transportation or different modes, reduce those down to essentially zero, and which, the general great ideas of planning, that's the goal, but you have to have the systems in place to be able to serve those uses and those people who live there. And so the reductions were starting to be cumbersome in how they were and unlimited, basically.
That's helpful. So I guess the way I should understand it is that this doesn't really address areas like the ballpark or 300 West in this ordinance, but a future ordinance that would actually change the zoning in those areas combined with this would try and get that to a better equilibrium point or a better balancing point. Is that?
I'll chime in on that a little bit as well. So, but also we did examine the uses themselves, and that's why I'm saying overall we feel we've helped address a lot of those uses a little bit better, or we've built in some other provisions and kind of things are generally a little bit lower. But Nick's right. We looked at doing this by a total map rather than zoning designation, and it just didn't treat properties fairly and consistently. And where do you draw those borders? And there was some different, some real challenges. And we felt that this does encourage upzoning. There's incentive to do so, and in making the right zone for the area. And so, there are definitely areas we see targeting. And the nice thing is, as properties are rezoned, they automatically get kicked into the new context. And in the parking regulations. So
So as we start looking at, for instance, ballpark, if we find that none of our current zones as written make sense, then we would draft an entirely new zone and choose which context that would fall into as part of that zone text adoption. Is that how that would work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that just happened with that's happening with the FEUN3 zone. I'm saying,
That
you
makes
know,
sense, yeah.
during this process, so yes.
Madam Chair, can I ask a couple more questions, or do you want to jump to? Okay, thanks. The next two questions are kind of related, and but one has to do with parking reductions, and the other has to do with use, the use parking table based on use. I've just noticed, and this is kind of from my professional practice, that I've worked on projects where there's small infill projects that currently work under the new parking ordinance, but under the currently work under the current parking ordinance, but under the proposed ordinance would become impossible. Those are typically small infill projects and office projects. And I think that's because the requirement for office uses goes up under this. I think the ground floor office parking requirement stays the same, but in the new parking ordinance, like second and third levels don't have a reduced parking requirement like they do in the current ordinance. And then also the exception for legal on-street parking goes away under this new ordinance, if I understand that correctly, which doesn't make a huge difference for big projects, but for small projects where like 3 parking stalls makes a big difference, then I found that those small infill projects are no longer possible. So those are two more specific concerns, I think, with this. Can you, I guess the question is with the office uses and then that on-street parking exception, are there thoughts?
So I'm looking up the office stuff as we talk, but let me speak first, if I can, to the second thing about the on-street parking. So that's something we looked at considerably, and we do understand it as a tool for small businesses. We do understand it can be a benefit. A few problems were happening. One is we felt it really creates a sense of entitlement. So even though they were just being granted a reduction, or they were being able to count those spaces towards their parking, when the city came through and wanted to do anything different, if we found that, oh, well, it made sense to put bike share there, or put in a bus stop, or use the right of way in any other manner that might actually help decrease parking needs or provide alternative transportation or whatever, that was a major battle, and we were creating nonconformities, or we're getting just people up in arms saying, you're taking away my parking. Well, it was never your parking, it was the city's, it's right of way. It should be used for the common good of all. And so we felt that there are really, of course, transportation can still approve that and allow people to park there, but it wouldn't be part of the reductions and things like that. And that's something we went through pretty considerably.
Yeah, and I understand that. That makes some sense. And I think, I guess the concern is that those small infill projects become impossible without that. And I wonder if there's like a small project reduction that could be allowed, or something that would be similar. Because I think that on-street parking, when you have a whole block face, I agree that's a huge project and they should be able to accommodate that all. But if it's a 0.15 acres or something, and they're trying to do a little shop there, then their parking requirement will completely make it impossible, and could only be a house, for instance, or something like that. So I don't know. I guess some other alternate, maybe it's in there and I don't understand it.
So we did make revisions to our change of use. So when a building goes through a change of use, an existing building, when it goes through a change of use, when it is triggered in the new parking. So it now is, their parking demand would go up by 10 spaces. So generally speaking, that's not for those small little businesses. So if they just only needed 6 or 7 stalls, they're able to just go in and they don't have to increase the parking. or anyways, it's 10 spaces or more than 25% of the parking stalls that exist on site. And then also for buildings, for changes in use in buildings built prior to 1944, no additional parking shall be required. So we tried to make some provisions for reusing some of the building stock a little bit better and not trigger new parking regulations. So that's one area we've done it.
That's
And
for
then, of
existing
course-
buildings, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So are yeah, that's going in a reuse or something like that. But if you're talking new construction in an area, then again, it's more based on what we feel are hopefully more right size parking requirements and appropriate reductions. But I am still pulling up office uses. So office, depending on the context, transit context, we're proposing no minimum, urban center 1 per 1,000, neighborhood center 2 per 1,000, and in the general context 3. I can pull up how that correlates to the existing, but a lot of those uses are going to take place in transit and urban center context, because that's where a lot of the most desirable land is for that type of thing, but for those infill projects. But let's see.
Hey, Darren or Madam Chair, can I ask a clarifying question on what you think? Are you asking, Darren, are you saying that for smaller infill projects in some of these areas, the threshold is too high, raising costs of that development, or it's too low, causing pressure on the street or the parking?
I think under the new ordinance, it becomes too high. There's two specific sort of potential projects that I worked on. One was in 9th and 9th, and one was in Ballpark. And this was not as a council member, this was as an architect. The 9th and 9th one, so the Ballpark one maybe would be adjusted once we do that whole area-wide master plan. So that concern might go away. But the one in 9th and 9th was a small retail and with some residences above it. And that one was only possible, we had to rush it through before council adopts this new ordinance, because it was only possible for under the current ordinance. And that one, the reason for that was because of the on-street parking reduction. And maybe, I mean, I guess we could argue that that project is underparked. It could be argued that that's I don't think it is. So I'm concerned that some of those small infill projects just can't happen under the new ordinance. And maybe that the office parking thing also goes away when we rezone some of those areas. So that might not be an issue.
Thank you, Darren. Did you have another follow-up question, Darren?
I got a lot of questions, but I'll keep it to one tiny thing. I would hope that there would be a way we could, if we were to adopt this without any changes, that we could give like a buffer period of 6 months or something, so people that are currently working on a project right now, if it changes sort of mid-design, they don't have to start from scratch. So maybe there's 6 months, maybe it's a year where they can choose either the old or the new parking ordinance before we completely get rid of the old one, just so that people have that window. I don't know if that's really possible, but I'd like that.
I think that's a good point. It was brought up in our packet as one of the policy questions of having an effective date. And I think that's something we can certainly implement, right? I mean, we have that ability, and probably something that we would want to consider. The problem here, we have James James's internet just went out and Anna's internet just went out, and I need to take a phone call. We would still have a quorum if somebody would volunteer to chair the rest of this discussion for right now. Anna's back. Chris, do you mind?
Sure, happy to.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Go ahead.
Question. So I may be a little slow on the parking side of here, and I have maybe I'm dovetailing into Darren's questions, Councilmember Mono's questions about the parking, and also the amendments that we're looking at for RMF 30 and RMF 35 and the affordable housing overlay. How do these all dovetail into each other? And are we looking at the future for those zone changes with this new parking amendment?
Yeah,
you've already answered that, Nick, but you're just gonna have to maybe answer it in a different manner for me.
Okay, I'll do my best, and if I'm confusing, please stop me and help me out. So the short answer is yes, we have considered as many of the pending zoning changes as we possibly could have with this ordinance. So, for example, I believe the RMF zones are remaining in the general context. And so for the residential uses, the minimum in those districts, if it is changing, it's changing by, I think, at most a half a stall per unit, but I don't think that they're changing even that much in that zone. And Eric had that table in the presentation that showed that. What the affordable housing overlay is likely to do would be the parking ordinance has a reduction for affordable housing up to a certain percentage if a certain number of units are applied. The overlay is likely going to change how that is applied. So the best way to look at that and to consider that is as a placeholder until that affordable housing overlay gets put in place. We don't know yet what that potential change is, but it's certainly something that we have circled as a point of not conflict, but a point that we need to make sure that we're correcting as we go through with those proposals.
Thank you. And one more question. Total parking spots people are all concerned about, oh my God, you're taking away parking. Is there really much of a net difference with what we have now and what we would have in, say, 15 years from now, as far as parking is concerned across the city with this change? Or would it be about the same as where we are now?
I would anticipate that as properties redevelop, particularly in the transit context, that we will see less parking than what would be built without this code, without this proposal.
And exactly what we want, right? Because that's why we have the transit there, so we'd have reduced parking. But in the general context, or maybe the neighborhood centers, it would not be much of a change?
I don't think there'll be much change. I think Councilmember Mono identified, one of those potential issues with the smaller scale infill, and we're happy to try to find some resolution to that. But I wouldn't anticipate much change in those two contexts.
Okay. I'll chime in one thing on that. I think where you will see a reduction in those contexts is when they do what we consider to be something really appropriate for an alternative, like provide a really good car share program where, say they build a housing development that, the residents have the option to buy into a certain amount of time on a vehicle, or, some of those, or there's a really good carpool program or something or other for a business. But it's not going to be just across the board reductions in those contexts.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Current Chair, Madam Chair. Question about the affordable housing question you had. About council's sort of take on how much reduction affordability should be. Is that what you were looking for? Okay.
Yep, that's correct.
So I saw a nod of the head from Nick, yes. I think I'm working under the assumption, number one, that less parking means lower overall cost to develop and therefore more units per acre. Is that accurate?
I don't know that it necessarily results in more units per acre. It results in lower construction cost per unit.
But we assume that that might add to more units per acre, or maybe not.
It could, depending on, for example, if a project was going to be mostly surface parked, then they could potentially have more density. If they're going into a structure, the parking reduction doesn't necessarily change their, at least from what I've learned and heard from some developers, is that it doesn't necessarily change their pro forma unless they're already going in with a very reduced amount of parking. And so we have seen some, and a lot of that's going to be tied to their funding sources. So there's some lending sources that are a little bit more conservative in terms of what they're willing to fund parking wise, but because the return on investment in real estate is so high right now that and interest rates and other investments are so low that there's a larger percentage of or a higher dollar amount of investment going into real estate, and the people are willing to take more risks than they were 10 years ago. That's why we're starting to see in like Central Ninth some projects built with no parking, which is kind of mind blowing for a city like Salt Lake. And with the even though that has good transit access, it doesn't fully have those services right there, and so it's a little bit of an oddity. But yeah, I think if there were surface parking lots, it would be a different approach to more density than if it's structured.
I think that goes to the heart of the discussion for me then, because parking can sort of be an incentive to bring down costs of development, which we want to, but the cost of development and the price of a unit are not necessarily the same. The price of the unit is going for the market of demand. The development costs are what they are. If the market wasn't so hot, they might be more closely tied, but right now you can build for this and charge sort of for more kind of thing. So as a tool of getting more housing in more affordable sort of realm in general, I don't know how effective this is right now, because we're not seeing a lot of surface parking, are we, along transit lines or downtown? There's just not mass footage, right?
We're seeing some behind buildings. There's a project that was just approved, I think in December, in the ballpark neighborhood that actually used surface parking lot, a surface parking with a parking reduction. So I think one of the places where it is beneficial is on the end user side, is if a tenant has the option not to choose a place that they don't have to pay for parking, then that could be a significant impact on their living expenses. So that's where it's primarily beneficial. This ordinance, some ordinances will do what's called unbundling the parking, which requires parking to be a separate type of expense that the property owner would have to manage. And this ordinance doesn't deal with unbundling of parking, mainly because of the resource it would be required to monitor over time. But that's, yeah.
Okay. I think if we're using this as an incentive to get more people out of cars, I'm not sure it's the best incentive, but setting that aside, if we're using this to bring down the price for an affordable housing unit, which I think we are in this context, right, for a reduction, it would make some sense, but I think we're going to have to tier it based on the level of affordability very much. I'm concerned that giving that benefit to an 8% AMI is not nearly the same as giving it to a 40% AMI and the cost of the development and pulling that development off. So I think I would recommend for the reduction for affordability to be tied very closely into the AMI level. The other question for me is, we've taken a policy position from the RDA side to say we want mixed income across the board. We don't want very many standalone, all affordable projects anymore. Now, there's going to be some, there's no question there. But if that's our policy across the board, how do you apply this to tens of buildings across the city where, I would like to say hundreds, but I'm not too crazy, where there's going to be a mix of number of incomes? It gets a little tricky in there, where as long as I put in something that's below 100% AMI, do I get a big reduction, which doesn't seem right to me, but maybe I'm off on that.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that as we flesh that out a little further.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. We have a question from Anna in the chat. As I mentioned, her internet is kind of going a little berserk. So if Eric or Nick would take a look at that and address that question for me.
Yeah. So the question is about the parking study that's ongoing in the Central 9th and 9th and 9th. And what that parking study is doing, it's looking at on-street parking and use versus availability and things like that. And like Eric mentioned in his presentation, we just this morning received kind of a preliminary view of that report. And basically what it's finding is that unlike most in Central 9th, unlike the 9th and 9th area, the on-street parking demand is being created by residential uses versus commercial uses. And so it's having this kind of weird impact in that the parking is not available to the residents when they're home, and we're not seeing a turnover during the day because right now so many people are not using their cars. And so it's kind of this ironic thing. But what it's suggesting is that the perception that people have of on-street parking is that on-street parking is not available when about 70% of it is full. And so they're suggesting that Central 9th, at least for the moment, is at that point. And if there continues to be development with that's built with no parking, it's going to make that situation worse, which is fairly obvious. It puts us in this weird situation where we have a track station that has access to every single line in the system that has high frequency coming through it and headways, where you'd think that a no parking approach would be the best practice, but in reality, it's not necessarily turning out that way right now. And so what they're suggesting that it might be worth considering requiring some parking for residential uses versus right now where the residential uses in that FBUN2 zone are not required to have any parking.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Oh, great. So Nick, like then with this study, what are we trying to accomplish? Like a solution to this, and then to implement it, and should we wait until we do FB2 somewhere else?
Well, we're already seeing the FBUN2 pop up in other parts of the city. But the intent of the study, as I understand it, so it's being led by transportation, is that it was an on-street parking management tool to figure out these two neighborhoods and what's the best way to manage the on-street parking and what kind of measures the city can use to do that. And so they just happen to, because of how much opposition and comments that we're getting from these neighborhoods about the impact that development's having on the on-street parking, is that they looked at that to offer some kind of high-level analysis and recommendations.
Okay, so this would not be, you don't anticipate like changes to the parking requirements or specific to this neighborhood, or?
Well, the study is recommending that I can't remember the number, but at least some parking be required for residential uses in the FBUN2, which would require it to be moved to a different context. And so that's where it gets a little bit challenging with this approach, and something that we haven't seen the end results yet. It's just a preliminary thing. So we're not quite sure the best avenue to take and how to address it.
Okay.
It's, if I can chime in there, it's considering a 0.75 spaces per unit ratio. That's what it is, the initial findings are. And it also says that once land uses, once there's a more diverse land use adoption through there, then maybe to be revised again. But
yeah,
there's just not enough diverse land uses.
And the tricky part about that is that I don't think that we have 0.75 as a ratio in any of the contexts. And they're at a track station, so they'd get that reduction within being within a quarter mile for at least in almost the entirety of the Central 9th neighborhood, if not all of it. And so we'll have to look at both at those, how all of those things come into play and settle on a different context, if that's what the direction the council provides us.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris?
Thank you. So Nick and Eric, I appreciate all of the information you've given so far and the work that's gone into this. But I have to raise this concern on behalf of some of my residents about I understand that part of the reason why we don't have a more walkable city is because we didn't maybe put into place all of the things that we should have to incentivize people to get out of their cars a long time ago. But what do residents do while we're in this, pretty long transition phase where it's kind of like where most residents in Salt Lake still need a car. There's frustration around the fact that I think from some residents in certain areas that feel like the city's pushing too hard to incentivize building without having at least one stall per unit, and that's pushing these cars into neighborhoods, especially like historic neighborhoods that are already kind of tight on space. I've had a number of residents reach out to me on that, and right now a big part of that is all of the TSA zones that surround the Guadalupe neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And the Cozo house in particular, that people are really frustrated about and feel like that's the city's maybe being overly optimistic in our goals about TSA zones.
Yeah, so I think there's no question there's going to be growing pains as cities transition. And there's also a fairly harsh reality that if we want to be a city of people where we are improving our air quality and our environmental impact, car use has to be reduced. There's not any other way around it. There's not a city that's been able to plan for cars and people and reduce their environmental impact. And so we can't do all three of those things. We're going to be growing. We're going to be adding people. and that's gonna add some impact. But I think what this proposal does is that, unlike our current ordinance, where you can essentially in almost every part of the city reduce your parking requirement down to zero or close to zero, this starts to change that dynamic a little bit. One of the things that Eric mentioned is that, before our maximum parking was actually much lower than cities that are much more transit rich than we are. For example, our maximum parking for restaurants was citywide at, I think it amounted to 2.25 stalls per 1,000 square feet. That was, I think, like 80% lower than downtown Portland. So that tells you that, back in 2008 or whatever, when that regulation went into effect, we took a giant leap as a city that we weren't ready for. And so this I think is a more moderate approach, because it does start to increase some of those maximums for other things. I think that there's other pieces that need to happen, particularly on-street parking management, to make this work better, so that in those neighborhoods like Guadalupe, where you have more low density neighborhoods tightly intertwined with very transit rich areas, where we can start reducing some of those impacts to those neighborhoods, so that they don't have that. But that's another step that needs to happen, and I know that it's probably something that our transportation division would also recognize, and that's something that's in their shop. But I think that is an important piece to this. Right now, our for example, our residential parking permit program is only allowed around large institutions that bring in a ton of jobs or a ton of visitors, like the University of Utah or hospitals or Westminster College and those kinds of places. And so there might be a need to consider that in other contexts as well.
And do you think? Sorry, follow-up question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Eric. Say what you were
I was going to add one more thing to that. I think one of the keys for us as well is really the framework of this proposal. The exact numbers, the minimums and maximums, those will probably change numerous times and will be re-examined and fine-tuned throughout it. But we really feel that this framework of context puts us in a much better position. Rather than this one-size-fits-all, we're now looking at the characteristics of our neighborhoods, looking at the characteristics of our, the different portions of the city, and saying, okay, they don't all have the same needs. They're different. And in the future, this could be expanded to be 6 contexts, or it could be reduced to 2 contexts, and the numbers can change and things can change, but we feel that this is a really good framework to help us start to move forward and to make a step forward in many regards. So.
Okay, and then my follow-up question was just, do you think that we need to re-examine the parking requirements for TSAs in general? Or do you think that this maybe makes it so that we don't need to do that?
Well, I would be very hesitant to start requiring parking, at least in the core areas of our transit stations. Those are the areas where it's the highest likelihood of people to use the transit. This proposal does well in the TSA transition areas do have some parking requirement, and this maintains that. And so I would be hesitant. I think the other piece to keep in mind is that in the TSA zone, we still haven't had a project that didn't build parking. They're all, just because we don't have a minimum doesn't mean parking's not going to be built. With the exception, the likely location of that is in micro housing. And it's because it has a significant impact on the cost to build that. And there's a fairly small margin there if parking is required. And so that would be the area where it would be impactful. But I couldn't recommend that we start requiring parking in the TSA zone more than what we have.
Okay. Sorry, that leads me to one more quick. Can I ask one more follow-up, Madam Chair? So Nick, and I'm not saying that, there are residents that I have that would say we're not going far enough, and then there are residents that I have that are saying we've gone too far. So I just want to be clear that I'm trying to ask questions to better understand both sides of that and come up with a determination about where I think we are. With the Kozo house, and that being it's just off of North Temple, which is a great node for TSA because you're right by Front Runner, you're right by the North Temple line, but Kozo House isn't actually on North Temple. It's like tucked in, and it's getting toward the northwest quadrant or the northwest historic district. I mean, if this ordinance was in place when that was built, would this have changed anything?
So possibly one of the issues with Kozo is that they were able to stack their reductions. So they were in a TSA transition zone, right. And so they were able to stack the reductions that the code allowed, and they're a perfect example of what happens when you allow those reductions to go further than that. But there's also the reality that it is within, I think it's within a 600-foot walking distance of a transit platform. So if there's anywhere in the city where someone could live without needing a car, it's going to be in a situation like that. And it's one of those really difficult spots where we have these well-established neighborhoods next to a significant transit investment that not just the city made, but the region and the state made. And so it's hard, if we're going to grow, our master plans and our policies say that's where we're going to grow. And so, that's one of those examples of some growing pains that we're going to experience as a city.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, sorry. Thanks, everyone. Andrew had another question.
Yeah, hi, Madam Chair. Are there plans to have this discussion dovetail with an on-street parking discussion with transportation coming up?
I'm happy to circle back with them and figure out where they are on any of those things. I don't know the answer to that.
I think this is an important piece, Madam Chair, because a lot of the things that are coming to my head, I like the framework of this, but a lot of the issues are actually tied to the on-street parking. Because if you look at Central 9th, for instance, pre-COVID, I saw a lot of folks parking to jump on tracks to go downtown. And so it's not a residential issue or the commercial business there. It's about utilizing the track station as a jumping off point. And when you're outside the downtown core, it's unmetered parking for the most part. So if I look at 9th going south, 13th has got its own parking lot. But if I look at North Temple, where a lot of micro units are coming online and there's no metered parking, this could be an issue there if we don't have a better sense of the on-street parking needs that tie together there. So I would love to see us have a conversation with transportation and planning about how they interact with each other and see if we can figure out some solutions.
Great, thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? Darren?
Sorry, thanks. In regard to the micro-housing discussion that we were having, I think, Nick, what you said makes sense, that right now the only projects that would be built with no parking would probably be those micro-housing projects. But where we see in Central 9th that a lot of those micro-housing projects are being built in close proximity to one another, it does create the parking concern. And I guess I would either want to figure out how to resolve that within this ordinance or figure out a different way to limit the number of, like, the proximity of one micro-housing unit to the other. Or we just have to be really honest with the neighborhood that this is going to happen and that's the direction we're going, and decide if that's the policy as a city. But it does seem like I'm hearing quite a bit from Central 9th that their parking situation doesn't isn't working anymore. So I don't know how to do that, but I guess I just want to make sure that either we're figuring out a way to solve it or we're being really honest about the fact that we're not going to solve that.
Okay. Well, Eric and Nick, thank you for a robust conversation. I imagine we will be having more of these conversations regarding this issue. And
Madam Chair.
yes.
Well, so the council tonight is going to set a date for a public hearing on this, on the proposed ordinance. And that public hearing will be March 16. Just listening to the conversation, there are about a minimum of half a dozen issues that seem to need either council direction or comment from parking or from planning and from transportation. So, and included in that is the conversation that Councilmember Johnson just spoke about how it dovetails with the on-street parking study. There's the recommendation of Fair and Peers, you know, the question that planning presented, that given the Fair and Peers study is there adequate off-street parking in some areas? And what are the maximum requirements? What are the appropriate maximum requirements for multifamily parking? Are affordable housing reductions adequate? How does one, and this is something that planning requested from the city council, is direction on how would the allowed parking reductions be applied or packaged or stacked to have, you know, to avoid having someone coming up with zero parking requirements. And then there are the two other issues in the transmittal. So how does the council want to proceed in responding to all those questions?
Thank you, Russell. I think what we should do is still have set the public hearing tonight and then have a follow-up briefing after the public hearing comments. I think that would allow for obviously the public to comment, but then, you know, maybe define some of those questions even more so that we have, and then have a follow-up briefing on this at a later agenda.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate it. We are going to jump back to item number 3. Kate Bradshaw, our lead lobbyist, is here to give us a legislative update.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm down in the basement of the Capitol. Great. Thanks for skipping over me and coming back. The action on the floor had an issue I needed to attend to. I thought I would cover a couple of the bills that are most on our radar from a lobbying team perspective. But if you have other questions about bills on the tracking list, please feel free to interject with any questions, and I'll just dive right in unless somebody stops me. So the first update I wanted to give is on billboards. There are 2 different, let me back up, there are 3 different billboard bills. 2 of them are actively moving, have been assigned for committee hearings. One was pulled off as we negotiated on the Senator Sandel bill. As I reported last week, we've been in negotiations. The league has been in negotiations with Senator Sandel for the last couple of weeks on key components of this. It looked like, and you probably received action at the end of last week, the negotiation pass. But luckily, with the long holiday weekend, provided plenty of good working hours, and it looks like negotiations are back on track and progressing. So stay tuned on this one. We hope that we may be able to report something shortly that'll make sense for both parties, both the municipalities and those that are pro billboard. There's been a lot of negotiations that have gone into this, and of course, City Attorney Katie Lewis has been doing a great job making sure that some of the unique issues for Salt Lake City are well represented and brought to the attention of all cities. I know she loves it when I mention her name because then she turns on her camera. So that's where we're at on that bill. So definitely just a little more of a happier report than where we ended last week on that bill. On homelessness, again, a key critical issue. The bill there, HB 347, was released last week, and it was not what was expected by the work group in terms of the Gardner plan that had been worked on and proposed over the interim. Good news is we are expecting, and I believe we have and have sent it to the city staff to review a new second substitute. The sponsor of that bill quickly realized it had not included all of the discussions that were important to the municipal stakeholders from that work that was done over the last year to incorporate all of those things. So now we believe that this new second sub will include the coordination of the local homelessness coordinating committee, of which Mayor Mendenhall serves on that committee, the state and the philanthropic groups, so that that Gardner framework is fully implemented in the second substitute is what we're hoping as it is reviewed. Right now, there is not a plan in that bill to change the amount in the public safety mitigation fund, which is not as big and as robust as we would like to see it at this point. But hold on there. I'll give you a kind of a what to expect on revenue estimates towards the end. The next bill is SB 138. This is one that Councilwoman Fowler in particular I know has some interest in. This is what we affectionately have been calling the Riot Bill. And we also made some really great lobbying progress on this bill at the end of last week and over the long holiday weekend. Chief Brown was able to play an excellent role in helping us address some of the questions that two different Republican senators had about incidents over the summer and how they related to this bill. And based on the conversations that the chief was able to have, it looks like we have won their support to our side, and the momentum on this bill has definitely shifted, and it now looks like we may be able to change it to an effort to instead work on implementing best practices in terms of the public order unit and the mobile field force. And so the city attorney's office as well as the police department is noodling on what we could possibly suggest to the sponsor instead, as what the learned experience of the last year could be in terms of turning this bill into something that's just a little bit more positive and helpful, rather than something that was kind of aggressively focused on the incidents from last summer from the perspective of people outside and legislators from rural districts in the state. Finally, building code, HB 98, there has been these issues I'm bringing to you. These are some of those that have been negotiated from kind of the opening days of the session that were significant friction points between cities in general and different parties. And the building code bill in HB 98 is one of those where parties have been moving closer to agreement in terms of what might be acceptable in this particular instance. In particular, Salt Lake City is very interested, of course, in protecting historic districts. And Councilwoman Fowler, I know, has been instrumental in helping us work with the sponsor, Representative Paul Ray, to get his support for going just a little bit further than the negotiations had us at over the weekend on those historic districts, so that the compromises we're working on won't have as detrimental an impact in terms of the inspection process and the different requirements that cities can require for those historic districts. The other update, and again, this kind of alludes back to the question on funding for homeless mitigation funding, is the legislative process up here at the Capitol in the 7 weeks of the session is kind of geared in different levels. We spend the first 2 weeks of the session working on base budget appropriations. The middle part of the session is often very issue focused. And then towards the end of the session, the legislature receives new budget projections. And that guides kind of the closing of the budget and those policies and bills that require funding based on what those revenue estimates look like. Those new revenue estimates, and those will be what are used to close the budget, are going to be announced on Thursday. The report is, that Utah has been experiencing revenue growth, and that the impacts of the pandemic haven't been felt as strongly as were originally worried. It looks like most of the items that were cut during the special sessions in the summer are going to be restored. And then, the compromise that was struck between public education on the legislature will also be upheld. So public education will be seeing a significant WPU increase, as well as bonuses for teachers. I know that one is a little bit touchy in terms of which teachers were in classroom and which teachers were remote, but they're looking like they're going to be able to fully fund that commitment. And then there'll be still some funds, both ongoing and one time, that will be available for other priorities based on what we're hearing those revenue projections are going to be, which is that they'll meet prior expectations and maybe go up just a little bit more, which means that some of those appropriations asks that are in place for additional support with homelessness issues have a decent chance, given what we expect in those revenue estimates. I know I've run through those issues fairly quickly. Is there any questions I can answer for you about the work the team's doing, or other issues that you have questions about?
Chris?
Thank you. Kate, I think Councilmember Dugan raised, and then I asked to follow up about it on behalf of me and Councilmember Valdemoros, the street racing bill that we were pushing and that Salt Lake really supports. Do you think there's any chance of including in that, like, the modified exhaust ordinance or modified exhaust provisions?
Yeah, so Representative Musselman in his traffic code update bill is supposed to be including the language that was directed to help the street racing issue out in the Northwest Quadrant. In terms of the modified muffler issue, this has been an issue that has struggled a little bit. Senator Maine had a bill that dealt with it as well. It was seen as, the state of Utah did away with vehicle inspections, I want to say 2 years ago. And emissions inspections are what remain, but safety inspections for vehicles are gone. And anyway, Senator Maine had a bill that was attempting to bring some of those safety requirements back in at the time of an emissions inspection. And that effort has struggled just a little bit because of that overall position of the legislature 2 years ago to do away with the safety inspections. So we can of course always pursue that in Representative Musselman's bill on traffic amendments, but just to kind of give you fair warning that going back towards something that looks and feels like a safety inspection, which is where those muffler components would probably fall, will face an uphill battle because of the state's decision to go away from safety inspections.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, council members. Do we have any other questions? I know that there are some police bills, I believe, in committee right now. Is that right, Kate?
Yes, there is one coming up, forcible entry amendments, which I know you, of course, have some particular interest in. a new sub that was just proposed. So that is probably starting in the next few minutes.
Well, then we will let you get back to work. Thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you for joining us for this update. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Council members, we are about 4 minutes ahead of schedule. So we are currently in our agenda scheduled for a break, and we'll go ahead and take that. Let's see, we're going to do from 4:15 to 4:35. So everyone gets a 20-minute break at this time. Hi, Andrew. Let's get started, shall we? We are on agenda item number 8, which is the building inspections for modular or factory built structures. And we will have a briefing by Allison, and then we have Orion and Blake available, I believe, for this. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This item is a proposed ordinance to be able to use building inspections, to do building inspections in Salt Lake City for modular or factory built structures. Before I do a quick description, I wanted to mention that you did receive a corrected transmittal about an hour ago. It's in today's packets and it has today's date on it. There was just a minor thing that needed to be fixed. So the administration is asking the council to consider adopting an amendment to Salt Lake City Code to allow offsite inspection of modular or factory built structures. These are basically prefabricated homes that are built in factories, and most of these factories are located out of state. The idea and the interest of the administration is that these modular houses can be used either as accessory dwelling units, ADUs, on existing residential properties, or they can be used as standalone units on larger sites, possibly in multiples. Right now, there is no statewide building code regulation for this form of housing, but municipalities are allowed to adopt their own ordinances, and that's what this proposal would do. It's a minimal change to the existing ordinance, and the request is for the City Council to review this potential ordinance change and adopt the proposed amendment to the city ordinance tonight in your formal meeting. Obviously, that is your option, but I imagine Orion has a few things he'd like to say about that right now, if you're ready.
Yes, thanks, Allison. Thanks for your work on this. Hello to Council Chair Fowler and also to the other council members. Thanks for allowing us to be on today. I'd be ungrateful if I didn't thank you for the respect that you paid to Greg Mikalash last week. We miss him dearly, and he's left a big hole in our hearts and in our shop. But thanks for recognizing him as well. On the line today, we have available Paul Nielsen from the City Attorney's Office and also Nick Norris from the Planning Director. And we also have on the outside, we have John Hanna Spicagna from the Modular Building Institute in Virginia, and also Ryan Kolker from the International Code Council. Just in case that you have questions that they can answer, you'll see in the transmittal that both of them have written letters in support of the changes to the adoption of this ordinance. I think the impetus for the transmittal is really an increased interest by modular home suppliers to place those units in Salt Lake City. Many of these units that we've already taken in for permits are intended to be detached ADUs. And the thinking is that maybe they can provide some relief to our citizens for access to a wider variety of affordable housing in Salt Lake City. Just to be clear, these units are not mobile homes. Mobile homes are built on steel frames with axles, and mobile homes are regulated by the federal government and built to HUD standards. In our current ordinance, the city appointed building official is given the distinct responsibility for issuing permits, providing inspections, and final certificates of occupancies for all new construction throughout the city. And there's only very few exceptions to that. One notable exception would be to federal buildings. We don't get involved with federal buildings. As these structures in question are built in factories and they're not usually located in our local jurisdiction, it's not really practical to make those inspections using city inspectors. And I've included some city ordinances to refer to. Currently, the state allows local jurisdictions to adopt certain standards and policies and procedures to regulate this industry and other things. And this, even though all of the other technical building codes are adopted statewide, state statute does allow us some latitude in certain issues if the state hasn't adopted a standard. Currently, the statewide codes are the International Code Council codes, and they're adopted statewide with amendments, and the amendments are based on Legislative Oversight Committee's recommendations. The International Code Council has been working closely with the National Institute that is attempting to consolidate requirements and get them adopted nationwide. That's the Modular Building Institute, MBI. Both ICC, International Code Council, and MBI are in support of the city adopting standards that they have been working on, even though they will not be adopted nationwide until the next update cycle. The codes are updated nationwide every 3 years, and the state follows suit to that, most generally speaking. Both of these organizations have provided letters in support of this proposal and are standing by for questions. We are recommending that we adopt these standards early and make them effective in Salt Lake City as soon as our process for adoption can run its course. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Orion. And I will turn the time over to council members for questions. Anna?
Yeah, hi, Orion. Thank you. I'm sure about Greg's leaving a hole. Anyway, sorry about that. Can you clarify on the inspections, this leeway that we have or that the state gives us for?
Yeah,
the
well,
IDs?
it's not coming from the state.
Okay.
The two organizations that I mentioned, they've been working together to integrate these requirements into their next code cycle. We're not sure when that code cycle will happen. If it had already happened, then they would probably just be adopted statewide, and we wouldn't be having to have this conversation. We're not really sure when that will take place, but the standards that they've worked together on to produce are far enough along in the process where there's not going to be any changes that are salient, any big changes to when they're going to be adopted. I think COVID has slowed down that process a little bit, but it's a consensus-based process that's ANSI approved. So we'll be just in the position of adopting a little bit early, and it has a really orderly process for making the inspections on these buildings, even if they're built out of state.
Chris?
What if they're built in Canada?
Say built in Canada?
Yeah, I know one company that is in Utah builds theirs in Canada.
Right now it'd be a problem because I think Canada's border is still closed. But no, Canada would be fine as long as they're willing to build to the standards that are identified in the code. Currently, those units being built in Canada are being built to Canadian codes. So all they'll have to do is, in order to make that work for us, is to build to the standards that are in the International Code Council that we already reference in our other technical codes.
Andrew and then Darren.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So, Orion, prior to September of this year, when they'll pick it up again, I guess, how does it affect those companies functioning currently?
We've been in touch with those companies, and a lot of them have already applied for permits. I'm not certain that all of their units are going to be able to come into compliance, but they had a good positive feeling that the units that they've already built are already built to those standards, and that the tag can be affixed to them that we've recognized in those standards.
So we've allowed at least 6, I think, Modal homes or others to be installed right now. Are they up to the standard, or are they going to be essentially allowed to pilot prior to these standards going into effect?
Well, I don't know for sure because we didn't do the inspections on those units that they completed. But if those units are in compliance with the standards that ICC and MBI have been working on, then I think that those units will be fine.
If they're not, is there some issue we're going to have down the road with those limited number, potentially?
I wouldn't think so. they have to warranty that product for those homeowners. I'm pretty sure that the ones, we didn't issue permits to any of them where we didn't have the standards posted right on the title page of those plans, that they had to be inspected by our inspectors in order to be in compliance. So there may be units that they built that weren't in compliance that they would have to sell elsewhere.
I know there's one in my neighborhood that was just installed a couple of weeks ago. And if there's a turnover, gets sold, or some other shit comes up where it needs to be inspected, I don't know why it'd be inspected again, but there's no provision that those would be essentially grandfathered in. They'd still have to come to code then, correct?
No, but those would have been inspected, or else, unless they were installed illegally. So there was a group of those that we issued permits for, and that they had agreed to, that they were going to have inspections done locally. So hopefully those units are included.
So as long as it's part of that inspection locally, they should be okay. Okay.
Madam Chair. So the proposal would be that the modular factories could have their own inspections done. There'd be some kind of tag affixed to them or some documentation. Is there a local inspection then to look at like footings and foundations and attachments that will also have to happen?
Yes, Councilmember Mono, we'll be issuing permits for all of these, and we will be doing site inspections for the footings and the foundation system, as well as the setbacks that we are requiring for ADUs in specific zones, and then also the connection to those foundations.
Okay, great. And then did I hear correctly that we're being asked to adopt this tonight? And actually, and why is that typical? It seems like much faster than most of our ordinances would be adopted. What's the reason for that? You probably said it and I just missed it.
I think, Allison, do you have the answer to that question? I think Paul's on.
Yeah, let's defer to Paul, get it from the legal source. But I believe the issue is simply that it doesn't require a public hearing, so the council can act on it quickly if they'd like.
Correct. Actually, I wasn't aware that this was being adopted tonight, but it all works. This is not a land use regulation per se, so it doesn't have to go through that planning commission process.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Cindy, go ahead, please.
Hi. As I understand it, this has been an issue that has been a little confusing and held up for a while, just based on figuring out what's the best path forward. And I think there may be people waiting for this to get completed. And also there was some interest at the legislature in terms of whether they would need to pass a bill that would enable this, or whether the city was going to get to it quickly. So those were the reasons I was aware of, because you'd have to put it, I think, until March if you didn't do it tonight. So sometimes you do that. You certainly don't have to adopt it tonight, but it's there's not any procedural reason that you couldn't.
Yeah, because we're using these national standards, I think it's a pretty buttoned up proposal, really. We just have to make the references to those national standards, and we've already ascertained that the state is allowing us to do that. So I think the quicker the better. There are customers out there that are already sold and ready for these units to be installed.
Great. Are there further questions? I don't see any hands. And so, Orion, thank you for being here. And we will, I think, see what happens tonight.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
This is John Hannes Bacani with Modular Building Institute. if it would please the Madam Chair, I would just like to add a few comments for consideration of the group. I know we have at least one architect in the group and probably some others that I think I might be able to give some clarity to.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So just very quickly, a modular constructed building, whether it's a multifamily unit, a single family house, or a commercial building, it's being built to the same building codes as a site-built structure. It's just simply being built in a factory. So there's no difference in it being built to code. It's going to be built to whatever the codes are that the city requires. It's just simply being built in a factory, which is much more efficient, less waste. It's going to be greener because we have less waste, and also it's going to be completed anywhere from 30 to 50% more quickly. And just to give you an example on affordable housing in that front, I work on this across the country and in Canada as well. We just completed a project with the Fannie Mae of Canada, so the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, where they invested $1 billion throughout the country of Canada to do a rapid housing initiative only using modular construction. For the reasons I just mentioned, for the quickness of it, it's being built to the regular building codes, and the fact that it can be mass produced in the factories, which when you get it to site, that means less interruption at the site itself because they're just being put together almost like Lego blocks with a crane. So instead of having a construction site that's tearing up your street and affecting traffic and the public for months on end, it may just be a few hours or a few days or a week that it's putting the site together and then it's finished. And as Orion mentioned, they're doing all the regular inspections on site they would be doing anyway. So it's really, a win-win. Modular has been around since the 1600s. It's just something that I think now with especially the affordable housing space throughout the country kind of came to a head with COVID. And we're seeing this, in the Silicon Valley. Google, Facebook have invested millions of dollars in putting these types of structures together to house their own employees.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Did anyone have any questions for John? Andrew?
No, I mean, I don't know we have a question, John. I think that most of us are probably on board with the concept of lowering costs through efficient building processes. We just wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be an impasse for homeowners here and ensuring that our local regulations for safety sort of dovetailed and everyone was on the same page. So we're open to housing innovations here completely. So anything we can bring to the market that would help that, we're open to looking at least in my view, personally. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, John, for being here. Thank you, Orion. I don't see any other hands up, so we can move to our next agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is, and we are, oh no, we're right on time. A ranked choice voting overview and pilot project. There's been a lot of interest in this from different council members and constituents throughout the year since I've been on the council, so we decided that we should do a briefing on it. And I believe Ben Ledke is going to take us away. We also have Cindy Lou Trishman with the city recorder, Lauren Schaefer, assistant city recorder, and Pam Spencer. And I believe Sherry Swenson from our Salt Lake County clerk may be joining us as well. But I will turn the time over to Ben to get us started. Thanks, Ben.
This is an interim update, recognizing there are several factors that are uncertain and may change in the near future. Today, April 14th, 2021, is the deadline for the city to give notice to the Lieutenant Governor to participate in the ranked choice voting pilot program. A primary election is optional under that pilot program. Removing a pilot program is often cited as a significant cost savings for switching to ranked choice voting. There are 3 bills in the legislature's general session that relate to ranked choice voting. They're all House bills. HB 75, HB 127, and HB 174. These bills could change procedures and options for ranked choice voting elections, as well as the available funding for public education campaigns, if any is provided. In 2015, the city put together an interdepartmental committee that had $66,000 for a 6-month public education effort about the switch to vote by mail. And the council has expressed interest in a similar outreach effort for the switch to ranked choice voting. It's unclear if state funding would be available for that. In addition to potential impacts from bills in the legislature, there's also uncertainty about the county's operations and ability to provide ranked choice voting. I believe County Clerk Sherry Swenson would be here to answer questions on that. Examples would be cost estimates for holding a ranked choice voting election, the timeline to receive the new voting equipment, as well as test it and validate it, and assessing the different sizes of ballots. I'll turn the time over to Cindy Lou Trishman, our city recorder.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Council, we appreciate the opportunity to be before you in an open meeting to discuss this. Salt Lake City has received several inquiries as far as the interest of ranked choice voting and participating in the pilot project. So first, I'll just let you know, Lauren Schaefer is our new assistant city recorder, and she comes to us actually from the Lieutenant Governor's office. So she's worked on elections and campaign finance in the past and has experience with record retention. So she completed the updates to the memo and has been following the bills at the legislative session to make sure that essentially what Ben summarized, the bill numbers. Lauren will go through the impact of each one of them because some of them conflict one with another. I'll go ahead and just turn the time over to Lauren. And if you have questions, feel free to pop in and let us know.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I'm joining via the phone.
We can hear you. You might need to speak up just a little bit, but welcome. Welcome to the city. We're happy to have you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, like Cindy said, I came from the Lieutenant Governor's office. I worked in the elections division for exactly 3 years on my last day. And so I've had a lot of experience in elections. I've done state level, federal level, and I helped with the municipals in 2019. So I kind of can answer almost any question anyone has on elections. Like Cindy said and Ben said, there are a couple of bills up in the legislature that could impact ranked choice voting for us. And I'll just kind of run through them quickly, so stop me if you guys have questions along the way. Like Ben mentioned, we have to notify the Lieutenant Governor's office before April 15th if we're deciding to participate in the pilot program. If HB 75 passes, the recorder's office would no longer be able to provide this notice. The legislative body would have to, so essentially you guys would have to provide the notice. But we could obviously draft that up for you guys. And then if HB 174 passes, you would also have to notify the Lieutenant Governor of which voting method you'd like to choose. HB 174 brings in 2 new ranked choice voting methods. One is the star method and one is the approval method. The star method is essentially, instead of ranking candidates by who you like the most, it would be giving them a total number of stars out of 5, 5 being the best, and then averaging those amounts kind of similar to the way we understand ranked choice voting. And the approval method is basically the same thing. It's I approve of these 3 candidates, and then basically they average out the approvals of every other voter. And the candidate with the most approvals goes forward. So there are just a couple different ways of doing ranked choice voting, but those could change just kind of our timelines a little bit. And then in terms of budget, and this is something I'm sure Sherry will touch on if she's here, but if HB 75 passes, Salt Lake County would actually be required by statute to run the election this summer. And so the option for us to potentially contract with a different county or run it ourselves would be taken away. We'd have to go through Salt Lake County. And then let's see, that's kind of it in terms of updates with legislation. I guess, does anyone have questions on the way ranked choice voting works, or if any of those different methods are confusing? Is there anything I can help answer?
Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I know a lot of this depends on the outcome of those 3 bills. One of them says that we have to, by April 15th, April 15th, we would have to opt into a pilot program, but we have to verify that we would have the resources. Is that us and the county agreeing that we have the resources in this case, or how would that look for us?
So currently, it would be us stating that the city would have the resources. However, if some of those bills pass, it would essentially be saying that Salt Lake County would have the resources, or combined, we have the resources with whoever we choose to contract with. So it all kind of depends on what bills essentially pass, because they're very contradictory. But as it currently stands, it would be if the city itself has the resources based on who we're allowed to contract with.
So we would have to do, I mean, there's so many questions here. I guess we can answer after the session is over about the details. I'm personally in favor of this to bypass primaries. I don't like the effect of doing it for a primary as a pilot. I'd rather, I think the cost savings and the benefit comes by consolidating it to one. So I would be in favor of us pursuing this, depending on what it looks like after the session.
Great, thank you. Do we have other questions? Dan?
Thank you. I appreciate this, and I'm all for the ranked choice voting. I think this is a great step forward. Who else does the STAR method? This is the first time, about 2 weeks ago was the first time I heard about the STAR method. Does Maine use the STAR method? Does the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of Utah use the STAR method, or do they use the ranking method?
Currently, everyone uses the ranking method as far as I'm aware, and it's just those would be new options, I guess, starting this election cycle if that bill passes. But I'm not sure. I mean, Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding, is that so far nobody uses any of those other methods.
Right, this was new to us and to the committee as far as how this was going to move forward. So the STAR method was just introduced.
And I guess we have to wait till the bills come through. But right now, we would have a choice between one method, or would that choice be countywide?
That choice would be for us. So the city could decide, do we want to do ranked choice voting as we know it currently, or would we want to opt into the STAR or approval method? So the county would have to basically, Salt Lake County would have to accommodate all the different cities, but as it's written, our city specifically could choose whichever method we want.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions? I also have I have Pamela Spencer, the Vineyard City recorder. She is here with us, and Vineyard City did ranked choice voting last election, and maybe if Pamela wants to give a little update about Vineyard City's experience in moving to RCV. We'd love to hear. And then we do have Sherry Swenson here as well. So.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share our experience. I felt the election went really well. Our city council was all on board with it. Our residents, now granted we are a much smaller city than you guys are, but our residents thought it went very well. I had very few questions that were asked about it. Very few people that didn't understand it. It was pretty simple for everybody to figure out how to mark their ballots. We did some demos. We did some education. The state was great to work with us on it. They actually helped with the funding. They got the marketing company. They worked with us and with Utah County to put together video. I don't know if you've seen that video yet or not. They did a great job. I didn't like any of the videos that were out there. If you look them up, I just didn't like the way they're presented, and so I thought to get a different type of video. We compromised, and I felt this video went very well for us, for explaining how the ranking works. I think that's the biggest process. The hardest thing is, well, how does the counting work? How does that work on the back end? The counties, I sent your staff of Cindy and Lauren a link to how the county showed how they ranked the votes and how they worked and how it works. And I don't know what more to say about it, because I just feel like it went really well. That for Vineyard, no, it probably wouldn't have changed the outcome. But I know for Payson that it would have if that their second and third place people swapped on it. So it could change an outcome. We had 7 people on our ballot. We had 2 positions up for election at the time, 2 seats that were open, and I just really liked the way it worked, the options that it had. It made me feel, coming from a personal standpoint, is a lot of times I voted against somebody rather than for somebody, and I feel like the ranked choice took that away. So you're voting, you still get to vote for who you want to vote for, whether they're third or fourth person down the list, you're still voting for who you want. I mean, and like any other ballot, you still mark it however you want to mark it, like any other type of ballot. If you don't want to vote for somebody, you don't. So you're not forced to vote to rank every single person on that ballot. And the ballot just, it's pretty easy to understand, I felt. So I'm sure I could talk all day about it, but if you guys have any questions that you might have, that you've thought of, that.
Sorry, if I can just mention, Council Chair, the video that she shared is we've practiced and we're unable to get the audio to come through. So we'll be sharing the link to that video, and then to another video that's come out from Minnesota Public Radio about using Post-it notes to kind of display the scenario of how it's done. So we're happy to provide those. I just can't display them during the meeting today.
Sorry about that. It was working when I sent it to you, so that's too.
Oh no, sorry, Pam, they work. It's just the platform that we're on.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Well, that's too bad, because I worked hard on that. I didn't, like I said, I didn't totally like the other ones. The Post-it notes are kind of funky, but our little dots are, I mean, like I said, we compromised a little bit, but I did get what I wanted for the most part out of that video from them, so that it made more sense, I felt. And it doesn't have little animals on it. But I felt the other videos went towards high schoolers, middle schoolers, or, kids sometimes, and not adults. And I thought people that are voting are the adults, and so I wanted something that was a little more older, for the older population. So, but
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pamela, for being here and for sharing that with us and sharing that information. Again, council members, we do have Sherry Swenson, the Salt Lake County Recorder, on the line, I believe. And so if anybody has questions for Sherry, I would open that up. And I said recorder, I meant clerk.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sherry. I'm still drinking coffee, so.
It's okay. Everyone gets those 2 positions mixed up.
Sherry, thank you for taking time to join us. I know that we've been in conversations quite a bit of ranked choice voting. That's such a tongue twister for me. Do council members have questions, or Sherry, do you want to kind of give the county's perspective a little bit? Maybe we can go for questions after that.
Yes, so just to let you know, I know it had been reported, in fact, in the presentation to one of the committee meetings, Government Ops Committee, and in the newspaper, that I had refused to accommodate ranked choice voting. And I want to let you know that we did not have equipment that would accommodate ranked choice voting. So we were not able to create a ballot, tabulate a ballot for ranked choice voting with our previous voting system. However, we did sign a contract just on December 31st to get new voting equipment. We have not yet received the equipment. It's going to be coming in piecemeal. And there was a little bit of a delay in us getting the equipment. We had hoped and thought we would have it much sooner. But after my managers, 5 managers, our data analysts, and our IT service manager reviewed the 3 vendors, made our decision, the county council decided that they wanted our technology advisory board to weigh in. So we had to bring back the 2 finalists and have them present all over again. So I apologize that it's been a bit of a delay in getting our new voting system. We're going to be getting, as I said, the equipment. It's going to be coming in piecemeal over the next several weeks. And what we really think is necessary and important to do is test it and make sure that it can efficiently offer ranked choice voting. We've been in meetings with the vendor. We had a meeting on Friday. They sent us some examples of what a ballot layout or format would look like for ranked choice voting. And for Salt Lake City, where you have council districts, I don't foresee it being problematic because the complexity comes when you're doing at-large or multi-contest winners. And Utah has a very unique and different version in our law that provides for how those are tabulated, and they call it block preferential voting, which is not used anywhere else and isn't, in our opinion and the opinion of some of the information of the political scientists online, the fairest way to conduct ranked choice voting. But Salt Lake City's not in that position. So for that being said, we really are hoping to get the equipment and test it. I want you to know that I started offering contracts for cities in 1995, and I was the first county clerk to do that, and the first cities that came on board were Salt Lake, Sandy, and South Jordan, because at that point in time, prior to that, they were hand counting paper ballots after the polls closed. And I thought, okay, we have an automated system at that point in time. Again, it was the punch card system. But nevertheless, I had this automated system and staff that were trained to do elections, and I thought it would be a great benefit to the voters, and it really was. And after those first 3 cities came on board, the only complaint we heard that election is we ruined their election night party because we were through tabulating so much quicker than it would have been had they been hand counting the ballots after the polls closed. It snowballed from there. All of the cities came on board to contract with Salt Lake County. And we have been conducting elections for 18 cities, 12 local districts, and 5 metro townships simultaneously. And that's one of the things, you know, because of the complexity, we want to make sure that everything will work efficiently. Those local boards or districts overlap the boundaries of the municipalities. And so we've got some work to do to try to figure out how this can all come together. But I want you to know that I've always said I want to conduct the elections in the way that the city councils want us to do their elections. And it's been a great partnership and we hope to continue, but we'll be able to give you more information when we can get our hands on the system. And right now, we don't have it in our possession because of that delay.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you also. Sherry helped me with a presentation for the National League of Cities when we were talking about mail-in voting and how we're one of the first to do all mail-in voting and the amount of the increase in voter turnout that we've seen over mail-in voting. So thank you for your help with that, Sherry. It was interesting to other council members throughout the country. So I appreciate that.
You know, we had a 90.11% turnout of a record number of registered voters for this previous November election. In fact, the increase of registered voters in Salt Lake County was over 100,000 above what it was in 2016. And then to have a 90.11% turnout in Salt Lake County, 610,218 active registered voters. It was phenomenal. And it wouldn't have been that had it not been for vote by mail.
Yes, yeah, that is very true. Thank you, Sherry. Council members, do you have any questions for Sherry? Chris?
Sherry, it's good to see you again.
Hi.
When we talked, I think it was back in December or January, you said that there was a concern about like if a ballot was long and like even going to another page, that there would be all this, that there would be like an additional cost that was pretty substantial. Do you anticipate that being an issue in municipal races? Like, because as far as I can think of, there would only ever be one council member and the mayor at any time on a Salt Lake City ballot. Is that right?
Well, that was one of my concerns. In fact, we didn't know because Utah's law does not allow for a certain number of candidates to be ranked. It's wide open, which is unusual. So for example, in St. Paul and let's see, where's the other jurisdiction? They have at least 5 at the most that you can rank. There is no limit on the Utah law as to how many can be ranked. So I was worried about how that would fit onto a ballot. We did see an example of a ballot format just Friday from our vendor. And it looks like, for example, in 2019, you had 8 primary candidates for mayor. And how that would fit across the width of the ballot, we looked at it. I think there is room. I mean, if you get 16, it's going to be a problem. Just saying. And it's the space and the width of the ballot that I was concerned about, and the length of the ballot. So I don't think with a 2-sided ballot, it's going to push it to a 2-card ballot. Anytime you push it to a 2-card ballot, it's a lot more expensive. But the only thing additionally is if you added questions, bond issues, and things of that nature. So that was what I discussed with you and tried to figure out how, with this unlimited number of ranks or choices on a ballot, how that would fit on a ballot.
Okay. And then the other question I had was us talking about how to deal with the other, like additional costs, either if there is something like that comes up or we need another page, or the cost to educate voters that that we're going to try this and how to cover that. And I wasn't aware that there are, I guess, state funds available to help with that. Do you know if they would help cover the costs of like if the ballot issue came, or do they just cover the costs of informing voters? Do you know?
You know, I heard about the funds for it for the first time in a meeting about a week ago. And I checked with Justin Lee, and he said actually there had been $250,000 allocated for funds to help with that pilot project. I was not aware of that. He said there's now 200,000. Apparently they spent 50,000, and it might have been on the marketing that they did for Payson and Vineyard. I'm not sure. So I'm not positive of how specific that is. As far as it going to a 2-card ballot, a 2-card ballot presents a lot of issues that we haven't had to encounter in Salt Lake County. For example, you've got an affidavit on the ballot return envelope and a voter returns the ballot. And what if they return one page and they don't return the second page at the same time? The time that it takes to scan them would be greatly increased, the postage. So we haven't delved into all of that. Our fiscal analyst did a previous analysis that if we had a 2-card ballot countywide, it would cost an additional $194,000. So, you know, depending on the jurisdiction and the size and the number of voters, it would all be factored into that. One of the things I talked to you about also was the potential number of ballots to be adjudicated, additional to what we have. And so adjudicated ballots, if a voter starts changing their mind, crossing out this number and saying, oh, I need to rank this one instead. Every time someone on a paper ballot makes a mark on the ballot to change their mind, or even if they write us little notes or whatever, it pulls it out of the process. And then we have to send it to a team of 2 individuals to adjudicate and determine the voter intent. So I think with ranking an ungiven number of candidates, it makes sense to me that it's going to be more adjudication, and we haven't quite figured out what the cost of that might be. I know that Josh Daniels gave us the number for the adjudicated ballots in Payson and Vineyard, and it was about 10 times our data analysts figured out the number of adjudicated ballots that we had for our primary in 2019. So it makes sense, you know, the more opportunities and the more positions people have to mark, they're maybe going to change their mind and say, oh, I don't want this to be number 6, I'd rather it be number 7, and so on. So we're not sure how that's going to all work out yet.
Okay, so
Sorry, council member.
Oh, that's okay. I just had one more question, but
Of course. I just wanted to mention there's a caveat in one of the House bills that addresses the number on the ballot.
oh, okay.
I'm sorry, which one is that? If it's HB 127, it doesn't apply to the municipal pilot project.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and look it up. Thank you. I'll go ahead and turn it back to Councilmember Wharton. Apologies for the interruption.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks, Cindy. So my last question is just, you know, when can we, you know, if today's the deadline to give notice, that's a problem, especially because you haven't had a chance to test the machine. I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry, today is the deadline for you to give notice?
Yeah, oh, Ben, did I mishear you on that?
April 1st.
April 1st.
So, that I could have spoken more clearly, Mr. Chair. The deadline is April 14th under the current pilot program. I was trying to say the deadline as of today is April 14th, but because of the bills in the legislature, that could change.
Okay, got you. Okay, I misheard you. Okay, well, April 14th is still not that far away. Do you anticipate with the delay in being able to test the machines, like, is it realistic that Salt Lake City could implement ranked choice voting for this year, or do you think it's not realistic? And
you know, we're certainly going to try. Like I said, we're getting our scanners this week, additional equipment next week. What our idea is that we could have some good numbers for you by the middle of March, we hope. And that's what we're planning. At this point in time, I would have normally had a meeting with city recorders and said, you know, this is the cost for contracting your elections. And we haven't been able to do that because of some of the legislation and cities that are interested in ranked choice voting. And so we're a little behind on that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Chris. Are there other questions from council members?
Madam Chair.
Oh, Dan and Darren's hands went up at the same time. You're fine. Darren, go ahead.
I was just wondering on the number of rankings that are allowed. Does the city have even if the state doesn't limit that, can we limit it ourselves?
We don't see that in the statute, and the reference to the other statute is HB 127, and that's a ranked choice voting option that will pertain to the primaries in even numbered years that Representative Winder is presenting. And he did put a limit in that bill, but in the current law that exists, we don't see an option for anyone to say we can only rank 3 or 5.
Okay, thanks. My follow-up question is, if I understand that each sort of election or each sort of cycle might take more time to adjudicate and all those things that you mentioned. But would that be offset by the fact that we potentially wouldn't be having a primary at all? So overall, it would be less work, do you think? Okay.
Yes, definitely. The best benefit of this is to eliminate your primary. And I've said this a number of times. Not only if we can do this efficiently and accurately, we would like to have you be able to eliminate your primary. And quite honestly, I'd like to be able to eliminate the work that we do for your primary, because it is a lot of work for my staff. And so that's the best benefit of this. If you forego your primary and then go to the general election with the issues on the general election ballot. I heard you talking about star voting. Although they put that in legislation as an option, our system will not conduct star voting. Approval voting, yes, it will. And approval voting is something similar to just selecting at-large candidates. It wouldn't even take a change in the way we have done things in the past. It's just that you would vote for them like you do at large candidates. So it's a method of ranking candidates, so to speak, but approving of a certain number instead of the first approval, second, or rank, I should say.
Great. Dan, did you have a question?
I was just going to have a statement, so thank you. And thank you, Sherry. I was on that call on Friday. It was a wonderful discussion on ranked choice voting. And Stan Lockhart had some great explanation and stories about it. And one of his stories was about he took a study to an assisted living facility, and he gave out the ranked choice voting to a bunch of elderly people over 85, and he kind of did a short explanation to them and then gave them the voting. And without really any explanation to it all, they were able to figure it out, handle it. They had a great discussion amongst themselves. And when they turned in their ballots, they had very few errors or anything else there. So, when people are scared that ranked choice voting is complicated and difficult, it really isn't all that difficult. And with no real instructions, this group of elderly people, and I'm almost there, we're able to handle it. And so, but they had some great discussions there. So it actually does everything what we wanted to do, spurs that discussion, and it's not really all that complicated. So it was a great discussion, and maybe we can get Stan's remarks and we can send it out to everybody. But it was a great discussion, and thank you for being there, Sherry. I appreciate that very much. So just a statement. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I don't see any other hands up for questions for any one of our panelists. But thank you all for being here. Really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to join us and to provide this information. So thanks so much. It's good to see everybody. And we can move on to our next agenda item. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of, I'm pulling up my agenda. We are on to agenda item number 10, which is a board appointment to the housing. Yes. Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, please do. You had texted me and I completely forgot about the storm update. So please, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
It's okay. I just put a link in the chat to the National Weather Service, Salt Lake City. There's been a storm anticipated, but now it's looking like it's going to be much bigger than we'd expected. It's going to impact most of the Wasatch Front, all of Salt Lake Valley. And so I wanted you to know that our storm crews are already out there. They're pre-salting. They're out there in full force. They're in direct contact with our office, and they think they're going to be able to stay ahead of it because they're doing all of that work right now, and they'll stay on top of it. So I think that the benefit of us working online is that the city is still working hard, and we're going to be able to field all of your needs as residents and businesses electronically, just like we've been doing for months. But there may be delays to openings at other different levels of government. I think the county's talking about some delayed openings right now. And we just want to encourage anybody in the area who can avoid driving while the snow crews are out there at work tonight and into tomorrow morning. I think it's looking like 10 or 11 in the morning is when this warning goes through. So if you can go into work late, if you still commute, please see about making arrangements to do so later, or take your time getting around, because this storm is coming. Thanks, Madam Chair, for giving me a second.
Of course, thank you, Mayor. I would ask, Mayor, if you don't mind, in case I forget, if we could make a similar announcement during our formal meeting, during our questions to the mayor section of the agenda.
Happy to.
I think we have more people that tend to tune into our formal meeting, and that might be some relevant information for people that tune in at that time.
We'll do it. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, we will move on to agenda item number 10, which is our board appointment to the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. And see if Shelley Bodley is here with us.
I am here. Hello.
Hi. Good to see you.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your interest in joining the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. If you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in that particular board.
Yes. So I'm Shelley Bodley, and I'm an assistant professor at Salt Lake Community College. So I have tenure in one more year, which is the assistant part. I teach in the architecture department, and I live in the ballpark in District 5. So I have a husband, and I've got 3 little girls trapped down in a bedroom right now. So hopefully you guys don't hear them trying to break free. But we've had a lot of things going on downtown in Salt Lake, and I think Utah in general lately. We've had a lot of growth, and the ballpark is really changing right now. I'm sure everybody is well aware of what's going on over here. And, you know, I really wanted to be a part of kind of that formation of our community. And so I decided a couple of years ago to just really start getting involved in my community. And so, you know, I'm very interested in the growth and development happening here. I'm interested in homeless issues. I'm interested in affordable housing coming in, which will then, you know, help with the homeless issues. And so really, I sort of decided to start looking at some of these local boards and trying to become part of one so that I could have my voice heard and just really be a part of the process. And so the Housing Trust Fund was one board that I applied for, and thankfully looks like it's moving forward. I also was kind of interested in the redevelopment. You know, those were kind of some of the areas I went for, was the redevelopment, the Housing Trust Advisory. Ballpark doesn't have a library, so I also looked into, you know, was interviewed for the library board. But that's really what I'm interested in. I wanted to be involved, and you know, working at Salt Lake Community College, they really support local involvement. It's kind of part of my teaching engagement is to be out in the community, and they support that. And so, you know, not only was it a personal interest, but also really supported by my profession. So that's where I'm at.
That's great. That's awesome. Council members, I almost said board members, but council members, any questions for Shelley today? Darren?
Just hello, Shelley. Thanks for your interest in this board. And thanks for everything you've been doing to advocate for the community and ballpark and for everything. So appreciate you being interested in this.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Congratulations, by the way. I heard you got engaged recently. It's exciting.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I am unmuted. Shelley, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your interest. And you will be on our consent agenda this evening in our formal meeting that starts at 7. You certainly do not have to log in for that. It's towards the end of the agenda, but you will be there.
Perfect.
We look forward to it.
Gosh, that was easier than I thought. Thank you.
We try not to bite.
Perfect.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Next, we have another board appointment, again to the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board, and that is Jose Organista. Is Jose with us?
Council Chair, Jose messaged our team earlier and said he was going to be unable to make it tonight.
Oh, darn it.
Excuse me,
Okay.
he says he may be trying a new link now. We are working through some technical issues. I apologize. I will be right back with some more information on that.
Okay.
So maybe we can go to announcements really quick, if we have any.
That'd be great. There's nothing to report from the chair and vice chair, I don't think, unless James has something to report. And so, yeah, we can turn to report and announcements from the executive director.
Well,
Jen, are you doing that? Or Cindy doing that?
Apparently there's no announcement, so there goes that great idea.
Council Chair, Jose just logged in, so he should be here now.
Great. I do see a tile with his name on it. So Jose Organista, if you are with us and can hear us, and we'd love to hear from you.
Can you guys hear me?
We can now, yes.
Okay, perfect. Hello.
Hi. Jose, why don't you just tell us a little bit about why you're interested in being on the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board?
Yeah, so first and foremost, well, I just got back from an LDS mission, and 18 months I was just serving people, and I love to serve people. And you know, I got back because of COVID. They sent me back, and I'm just looking for ways to help. And I guess the Housing Trust Fund Board fits perfectly with the things I love to do. I mean, I'm studying business in college, and I'm also going to go into real estate, and I'm purchasing my first house this September. I'm Latino, and I'm doing it because District 1 is, you know, they have a lot of minorities in this district, and I just want to help those people that, and I mean, this Housing Trust Fund Board helps those people in need. And I think last time I talked to this group of 2 women, they told me that the Housing Trust Fund Board helps, I think it's homeless get back into kind of like into society with housing. And then there's a second one is like for people that have low income. And I think the majority of those people are people of color. So I'm here to help my community, which is majority of people of color. And I mean, I understand how they feel. I've been in their shoes, and I think I know I can give a little insight of how they might need housing in District 1, which is going through a lot of housing. I've seen that it's been going through a lot of housing issues. So that's the main reason why I want to help. And I also want to serve my community, and this fits perfectly. I mean, I applied to two other boards, but I think this one's the one I really want to stay in. So this is the one I'm going for. So yeah.
That's great. Well, board member or council members, do you guys have any questions for Jose? I just see some thumbs ups.
I want to ask one thing. Hi, Jose. Are you related to Joel and Mario?
Yeah, they're my brothers.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well, welcome. I'm excited that you're applying and your family is really involved in the community. So, wow, so cool. Have a third organista involved. Thanks.
Thank you.
It is great. And, you know, I have to say, I appreciate that we are having younger people get involved in our boards and in our civic engagement. And so I commend you on that. I don't think I got involved into politics until I was older, and so that's awesome. And we look forward, thank you for wanting to serve. We look forward to having you on this board. You will be on our consent agenda and our formal meeting at 7 o'clock. You do not have to log in. You can if you want, but you certainly don't have to. And we'll go from there.
Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay. All right, team, and everyone watching and participating with us. We are at the end of our work session. We do not have a closed session today. That means everyone gets over an hour for a dinner break. So enjoy, and meet us back here for our formal meeting at 7.